Being that it is 6:30 and we have a quorum of commissioners present, I will call to order tonight's special meeting of the City of Sonoma Planning Commission for September 28th, 2017. Just quickly before we begin, I want to remind everyone in the audience or listening, watching at home that no new items will be heard by this commission after 10:30 unless the commission by a majority vote decides to continue the meeting. I hope that will not be an issue tonight since we have just a single item on the agenda. And I also want to remind everyone to please put into silent mode any digital or analog devices you may have. And having said that, I will have a roll call.
Commissioner Bohar.
Here.
Commissioner McDonald.
Present.
Chair Cribb.
Here.
Commissioner Seck.
Here.
Commissioner Coleman.
Here.
Commissioner Coleman, we are so glad to see you, and I would hope that you could lead us in the pledge this evening.
All right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
and to the republic for which it stands, one nation,
under God,
indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, are there any comments from any member of the public on an item not appearing on tonight's agenda? Please step forward to the podium, state your name and address for the record.
I'm not sure if this is which way it goes. It has to do with the parking situation on Broadway. I live,
In general, or
In
it's
general.
specific to this project?
no, in general.
Okay, I think in general, then that's okay, yes.
Okay, I'm Virginia Hogan. I live on Woodworth Lane. And as time has progressed in the 30 years I've been in that residence, it's gotten worse and worse. I have dogs. I have special needs dogs. I cannot come out of Woodworth Lane, make a left-hand turn to walk down Broadway on the sidewalk because the bicycle shop keeps their bicycles on the sidewalk, which is taking up more than half the sidewalk, and you've also got trees there. When asked to move the bikes, I am met with disdain. They bring their people in groups onto Woodworth Lane, which is basically private property. These people have not ridden bikes in 30 or 40 years. They teach them how to ride on our street. Broadway is 35 miles an hour at that portion. So I can come zipping around the corner at 35 miles an hour, come into my street, and I'm going to end up hitting somebody. I've already come very close, more than once. I get past that, and they have their cars and their vans parked on Broadway. They have delivery trucks parked on Broadway. So I can't walk down the sidewalk, so I have to go into the street. Can't walk into the street because I have to jig and jag between their vehicles that are double parked, delivery vehicles for the Pizzeria Capri and Traintown area, and I'm playing dodgeball with the cars and the trucks. As I continue down, I hit Traintown. I can't cut through Traintown on a weekend because you've got too many cars there. Again, I have special needs dogs. I am not going to submit my dog or myself to the possibility of being sued because some parent can't control their child when you say, please keep your child away from my dog. Back up, which means, again, I have to walk out into the street. Can I get down Broadway in the street? No, because Traintown does not have enough parking. So all their cars are allowed to park out on Broadway, Highway 12. The last time I read the DMV book, there was an article in there that specifically stated you are not allowed to park to the right of a solid white line unless there is a curb. There is no curb. Then if I want to get across the street, I can try and get into the crosswalk to nowhere. So if a bicyclist starts riding their bike up the street, I have to back up a little bit because otherwise they're going to hit me. I back up, I end up in the ditch. Who's responsible? I try and get across the street at the crosswalk to nowhere. Do people stop? No. Because it's a joke. It's the crosswalk to nowhere. I get down to the corner. I'm at Napa Road and Broadway. Four-way signal. Can I get across? Very rarely, because you have people that are not obeying the rules of the road, who make their own lane on Broadway going down at the hotel. There is no third lane there. People have made their own lane where the buses should be. They make their turns. Do they watch for pedestrians? No. No one on those four corners watches for pedestrians. Then I get yelled at because I'm trying to cross. The street lights there also for pedestrians. I have a bad knee that I've had surgery on. I've got a bad back. I cannot cross that street in 3 seconds before the light turns red. It's gotten to the point where it's absolutely ludicrous. You can't go anywhere, and I'm wondering, who do I talk to? What do I do to get this situation rectified? Thank you.
Thank you. All right, anyone else on an item not appearing on tonight's agenda? Okay, so, late correspondence?
Yes, there have been a variety of letters and different kinds of correspondence received since the packet was published. All of that is at your place tonight. Along with that are a set of updated conditions of approval that were previously emailed. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, then we will go on to agenda item number 1. And this is a public hearing on a project at 20261 Broadway. Tonight, we'll be reviewing the Alta Mira affordable apartments. That review will be a consideration of the environmental review, including a possible adoption of a negative declaration, and the consideration and possible approval of a use permit of site design and architectural review, subject to considerations and approval, and a mitigation monitoring program. We're going to ask that staff do their report first, then we'll ask for the applicant. We'll give them 10 minutes, and then any member of the public may speak, and we'll ask that you limit your comments in the public to 3 minutes each. So we'll begin with staff's report.
Thank you, Chair Cribb and members of the Planning Commission. The property that we're looking at tonight has an area of a little bit less than 2 acres. It's a flat rectangular parcel, and it's located at the northwest corner of Broadway and Clay Street. Right now, this property is vacant, but it supports a number of trees, including several large oaks. It had been developed with a home, a detached garage, and a former water tower, as well as several barns, but those structures were removed in 2008. 2 billboards that used to be located at the southeast corner of the site were removed early this year. The property is located within the city limits of Sonoma. It has a general plan land use designation of mixed use. That designation allows a residential density of up to 20 units per acre, although that may be increased with a density bonus for affordable housing. Adjoining uses include an office building and associated parking on the north. To the south, across Clay Street, is a hotel, the Lodge at Sonoma. To the east, across Broadway, there's a small shopping center as well as Train Town. And to the west, single-family residences, part of the St. Francis Place subdivision. And on the slide, we also see some adjoining uses, such as the Adele Harrison Middle School, and then above that is the Sonoma Valley High School. A little bit of background on just the history of the property may be in order. In 2007, the Sonoma Community Development Agency, that was the city's redevelopment agency when there was redevelopment, purchased the property with the intent of developing it with affordable housing. There wasn't any immediate action taken in that regard because the focus of the agency at the time was the development of another affordable site located off of Sonoma Highway. In 2012, ownership of the property was transferred from the Community Development Agency to the Sonoma County Community Development Commission as the parent agency of the Sonoma County Housing Authority and in its capacity as the successor housing agency. This transfer was the result of the termination of redevelopment agencies throughout California. As part of the termination of redevelopment, the city of Sonoma gave up its housing assets, and so those housing assets were transferred to the successor agency, which in this case, again, was the Sonoma County Community Development Commission. In September of 2015, the commission issued an RFP seeking a nonprofit partner to assist it in developing affordable housing on the site. The RFP called for the development of rental housing affordable at the very low and low income levels. That was identified as an objective in the RFP because there's a critical shortage of rental units in the city of Sonoma and Sonoma Valley, especially at those lower income levels. In addition, the RFP suggested that a component of the units be made available for households that have become homeless. In response to the RFP, 7 responses were received following an initial screen for compliance with the different objectives. There were 4 candidates selected for in-depth assessment and interviews with a selection committee. And out of that process, the development partner was selected, that being Satellite Affordable Housing Associates. And that was based on interviews and a scoring set of scoring criteria that resulted in basically a consensus recommendation in that regard. That recommendation was reviewed and confirmed by the director of the Community Development Commission, the Citizen Advisory Committee to the Commission, and the Board of Supervisors, acting in their role as the board of the Commission. Now moving on to talk about the specific development, Alta Mira Apartments is proposed as a 100% affordable project. It would provide 15 units affordable at the extremely low income level, 19 units affordable at the very low income level, and 9 units affordable at the low income level, along with a manager's apartment for a total of 48 units. And this slide provides information about the affordability categories and the associated rent levels. So as you can see, rent levels in the project would range from approximately $407 a month for a 1-bedroom unit at the 30% affordability level, to almost $1,200 a month for a 3-bedroom unit at the 60% low-income affordability level. The development plan, which is we're now seeing, calls for 48 apartment units. These would be grouped within 8 2-story building clusters along with a single-story community building. The placement is intended to engage the 2 street frontages, to provide a yard-to-yard relationship with the adjoining homes on the west, and to create a central common open space area that retains some of the larger trees on the site. The 1-bedroom units would be placed on the west, adjoining the residences along Bragg Street in that adjoining St. Francis project, as those 1-bedroom units are more likely to be occupied by smaller households and seniors. The 3-bedroom apartments, which are intended for larger families with children, adjoin the community room in a common open space area. That area would incorporate a play area for children as well as raised planter beds available for resident use. And there would be pedestrian paths that would provide walking access throughout the site. The main parking lot has been placed along the northern edge of the site with a smaller court designed to meet fire department turnaround requirements projecting southward into the property. The placement of the parking lot limits vehicle access to Broadway, and it minimizes potential noise conflicts with adjoining residences on the west. A total of 75 off-street parking spaces are proposed. Now, before this site plan was presented in the application for development approvals, the applicant, Satellite Affordable Housing Associates, began an extensive neighbor and community outreach process that resulted in a number of changes that led to the plan that's in front of us tonight. So those changes include relocating vehicle access from Clay Street to Broadway, eliminating 3-story building elements, relocating the parking to the interior of the site, increasing the amount of off-street parking from 61 to 75 parking spaces, that's about a 22% increase, and increasing the ratio of one-bedroom units and placing them again to adjoin the residential properties on the west. Okay, moving on to looking at this project through the lens of the general plan. Again, this property has a general plan land use designation of mixed use. That's quite a flexible designation in that it allows for a variety of uses ranging from 100% residential to 100% commercial. However, we would just like to highlight that the definition of the mixed-use land use designation, which is shown on this slide in its entirety, specifically identifies affordable housing at the low and very low income levels as an intended use. The project is consistent with the mixed-use land use designation and it would fulfill a number of general plan policies, especially as related to housing diversity and affordability. So for example, in the community development element, we have a policy that calls upon the city to promote higher density infill development while ensuring that building mass, scale, and form are compatible with neighborhood and town character. In the housing element, we have a policy that states that the city should facilitate the development of affordable housing through regulatory incentives and concessions and available financial assistance, and to encourage the sustainable use of land and promote affordability by encouraging the development at the higher end of the density range within the medium density, high density housing opportunity and mixed use land use designations. As set forth in the findings for use permit approval that were attached to your staff report, staff has reviewed this project in terms of all applicable general plan policies, and we find that it is consistent with the general plan. Going back to density, because 32% of the units would be affordable at the very low income level and the remainder would be affordable at the low income level, under state law, the project qualifies for a 35% density bonus, as well as other development concessions. The project density amounts to 24 units per acre, which is within the allowance provided for under the density bonus provisions of state law and the city's general plan. Now, with respect to development code consistency, this slide summarizes the different major aspects of the development code and with respect to what the standard is and how the project relates to it. So, for example, building setbacks, there's a front and street side setback requirement of 20 feet, side yard setback requirement of 7 feet, and a rear yard setback of 20 feet. The project calls for front and street side setbacks ranging from 9 to 24 feet, a side setback of 15 to 75 feet, and a rear yard setback of 15 to 22 feet. And in this instance, as also with respect to open space, we note that there is a concession requested. As I mentioned just a moment ago, under state law, certain kinds of affordable housing qualify for what are known as concessions and incentives, and we'll go through those in a moment. But again, moving down the slide, the project complies with the floor area ratio. It provides a floor area ratio of 0.53 compared to an allowance for 1.0. Floor area ratio is basically a way in which building mass is controlled relative to property size. Building coverage is proposed at 28% compared to the maximum allowance of 60%. With open space, there's about 13,500 square feet of common open space areas on this site compared to the normal minimum requirement of 14,700 square feet. And that's somewhat offset by the fact that the project includes a 1,000 square foot community meeting room. But that still represents a development concession that the applicants are requesting. With respect to height, the maximum height in the development code allowed in the mixed-use zone is 30 feet unless there's a third floor residential component, in which case a height of 36 feet may be allowed. 34 feet. The project is proposing building heights ranging from 20 to 30 feet. So let's look more closely at this issue of concessions and incentives. Here we have the relevant language from state law. In essence, well, I'll just quote it, a reduction in site development standards or a modification in zoning code requirements or architectural design requirements that exceed the minimum building standards approved by the California Building Standards Commission including but not limited to a reduction in setback and square footage requirements and in the ratio of vehicular parking that would otherwise be required that results in identifiable, financially sufficient, and actual cost reductions. So, in other words, under state law, if a project fulfills certain affordability targets, the project applicant is entitled to request a certain number of incentives and concessions. And based on the affordability levels of this project, they may ask for up to 3 concessions. And the concessions that they're looking for have to do with setbacks and with open space. And we'll get into those in a little bit more detail a bit later on in the report. I'd also like to mention with respect to parking, based on the parking standards for multifamily development set forth in the code, the normal requirement for a 48-unit project would be 90 off-street parking spaces, including 48 covered parking spaces. The site plan provides for 75 spaces with no covered parking. As discussed in the project narrative, 1 parking space is being provided for every 1 and 2 bedroom unit, and 2 parking spaces are provided for every 3 bedroom unit. That's basically the intent behind the applicant's proposal for providing 75 parking spaces. And that also allows for a certain number of just open parking spaces. While that total falls short of the city's parking requirements, as an affordable development, the project qualifies for a reduced parking standard, again pursuant to government code related to affordable housing. And under that provision, a local authority may not require parking in excess of a very specific ratio. For 1 bedroom units, 1 parking space per unit. For 2 and 3 bedroom units, 2 parking spaces per unit. Based on the balance of 1 bedroom and 2 and 3 bedroom units in the project, the maximum number of off-street parking spaces that may be required under that mandated parking formula is 73 stalls. The project provides for 75 spaces, which exceeds that standard. And that's actually kind of a separate provision in the law, so that's not counted towards those other concessions and incentives that I mentioned. So let's go back very quickly to the site plan. On the Broadway frontage, Building 3 falls short of the 20-foot setback, as does the community building. And on the west, adjoining the residences that are in the Bragg Street development, we have a building in the center here that provides for a 15-foot rear yard setback rather than the normally required 20-foot setback. So those are the setback concessions that are being requested. Next, I'd like to briefly review the environmental analysis that was conducted with respect to this project. This is a project that is subject to the requirements of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. That requires that agencies evaluating projects look at the physical impacts of those projects on the environment and identify potentially significant mitigation measures, and if any such are identified, identify any potentially significant impacts, and if any such impacts are identified, to then take the next step of identifying mitigation measures that would reduce potentially significant impacts to a less than significant level. And the major tool or starting point for this type of analysis is something called an initial study. It's essentially a very lengthy checklist that the city goes through that addresses potential areas of impact through a variety of topics, all of which are listed on this slide. So everything from aesthetics and agricultural resources to transportation, traffic, and utility system. So we go through this checklist, and within each of these topic areas, we look at whether or not the project is likely to have a significant impact. Now, the outcome of this analysis with respect to the Alta Mira apartment development is summarized on this slide, in that we've divided these topics into two columns, less than significant and less than significant with mitigation. In the initial study, we identify the areas of aesthetics, agricultural resources, geology, greenhouse gas emissions, hydrology, land use and planning, mineral resources, population and housing, public services, recreation, stormwater, and mandatory findings as having less than significant impacts. However, significant impacts were identified in the areas of air quality, biological resources, cultural resources, hazards and hazardous materials, noise, transportation and traffic, and utilities and service systems, specifically having to do with landfill capacity. However, within those different areas, we were also able to identify mitigation measures that reduced the potentially significant impacts to a less than significant level. And I'm just going to go through some of the areas of the initial study that are probably of more interest than others, beginning with construction, beginning with air quality. Air quality impacts, an air quality impact with respect to construction was identified as a potentially significant impact. However, the Bay Area Air Quality Management District has a number of best practices that it identifies as adequate to reduce such impacts to a less than significant level. And those requirements have to do with basically dust control. And so we have a whole set of those requirements that have been placed in the Conditions of Approval Mitigation Monitoring Program that will be sufficient to reduce potential impacts in this area to a less than significant level. And those requirements include watering the site, covering haul trucks, making sure that the site is kept clean, limiting vehicle speeds, staging the project appropriately, maintaining construction equipment appropriately, and posting contact information so that if issues are identified, that they can be resolved expeditiously. A major area of study had to do with aesthetics and visual impacts. And for this project, its visual compatibility was evaluated in three areas. Development code consistency with regulations that address scale, massing, and height, as well as design guidelines, views of the project along Clay Street and Broadway, and lastly, project-specific site planning and design, including consideration of how the project relates to neighboring residences on the west. Now, this first slide provides information on building heights within the project and that of adjoining development. For example, within the St. Francis Place subdivision, Traintown, and the Lodge at Sonoma. So as demonstrated on this slide, we're looking at just overall building heights ranging, again, in the project from 20 feet to 30 feet. We have buildings of, just to pick some examples, 27 feet, 24 feet, 23 feet. These building heights are representative of or in line with building heights elsewhere in the area, including nearby residential development. So just in terms of its overall scale and massing, the project does appear to be compatible with its surroundings. Now, taking a closer look, here we have the project as it relates to its immediate environs in terms of building height and the building footprints. Now looking at views from public streets, starting with Broadway, because of the prominence of the site on the Broadway corridor, the elevations of the project on Broadway are an important element in evaluating the project in terms of its visual character. The site plan calls for 3 buildings along the Broadway frontage, with the community building placed in the center, flanked by 2 apartment buildings. Building 4 is in the foreground. It would be located at the northeast corner of the site at Broadway and Clay Street. It features conforming setbacks of 15 feet from the south property line and 22 feet from the east property line. The community building features a minimum setback of 9 feet, while Building 3, which is at the which is the northernmost structure on the Broadway frontage, features a 13-foot setback. Both the community building and this northern building fall short of the normal requirement of 20 feet along the Broadway frontage. Because the community building has a maximum height of 21 feet, its presence on Broadway and South Street would not be overwhelming. Building 3 on the south is a 2-story building, and it's taller with a ridge height of 27 feet, but it has a 13-foot setback in its traditional gabled form, and its orientation with the narrow side of the building facing the street emulate other examples of development on Broadway. In general, it's staff's view that the project appropriately addresses the Broadway frontage, and it's our conclusion that the proposed setback exceptions would not result in a significant impact with respect to the visual character of the area, again focusing on the Broadway frontage. Now looking at Clay Street, that's another key factor in the evaluation of visual compatibility, as this element of the project serves as a transition to the residential neighborhood to the west. The Clay Street frontage features 3 apartment buildings designed as duets that break down into 6 distinct building elements. These are all 2-story buildings with maximum ridge heights of 29, 28, and 26 feet. They step down from east to west towards the adjoining residential neighborhood. Each building is presenting its narrow face to the street and features porches, entry walks, and low landscaping fences designed to engage the street. The building forms are simple, but the elevations feature porches, eaves, and insets that help reduce the scale of the buildings. Setbacks between the buildings are a minimum of 10 feet, and the setback from Clay Street is 15 feet. And next we look at the relationship of the project to adjoining residences on the west as a consideration in terms of potential visual impacts. The project site adjoins 6 single-family homes along its western boundary. There are 3 apartment buildings proposed in that portion of the site, Building 6, Building 7, and Building 8. These buildings are all 2-story structures with peak ridge heights as follows. Building 6 at 26 feet, Building 7 at 26 feet, and Building 8 at 30 feet. Internally, the buildings are set back 20 feet from one another. Buildings 6 and 8 feature conforming 20-foot setbacks from the western property line. However, Building 7 features a 15-foot setback, which represents an exception to the normal standard. To reduce the prominence of this building relative to neighboring homes in the west, the western half of this structure features only ground floor units. That allows the roof to shed down to a 10-foot plate height. And that's depicted on the slide that's in front of us right now. All of these 3 buildings make use of design elements to improve compatibility, including the fact that the roofs are oriented so that they slope down to the west rather than presenting gable faces. There are no west-facing windows on the second floor. Building elements facing west, and there are no solar panels that would be allowed on the west-facing roof elements. To further illustrate the relationship of the project with adjoining residences on the west, street elevations have also been developed, and those can be seen on this slide. So moving on to consideration of potential noise impacts. The map that's in front of us is from the noise element of the general plan. And as analyzed in the general plan, the primary source of noise locally is traffic on major streets. So this slide or map shows noise contours associated with major streets in Sonoma: Broadway, West Napa Street, Sonoma Highway, Napa Leveroni Road, East and West MacArthur Street, West Spain Street. And you can see that along the more heavily traffic corridors, those noise contours extend outward into adjoining properties. So when we see developments on these street corridors, we often have to look at whether or not the residential development built along these corridors would comply with state and local noise standards. So that was one element of the noise analysis. Another element included the operational characteristics of the project. That is, how would the project affect adjoining development, in particular residences located to the west. And a third part of the review has to do with construction noise. So to begin with, the resident noise exposure, measurements were taken at 2 locations on the site over a period of time to basically set the stage and provide baseline information in terms of traffic noise and noise associated with the loading dock at the Sonoma Lodge, which is across Clay Street from the project. So it was found that with respect to the outdoor open space area, which is centrally located on the site behind the community building, the sound levels in that area would be expected to be considered normally acceptable under the standards that are set forth in the noise element. However, with respect to interior noise levels within the apartments, the acoustical study found that the proposed construction methods would result in compliance with state and local standards in conditions where the windows are kept closed. However, for many of the units in the project, noise attenuation would be reduced to the point where interior noise levels could exceed the interior noise standard of 45 dBA if windows are kept open. So to address that issue, the noise assessment identified a very specific mitigation measure in which units within buildings 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8 will need to be equipped with a mechanical noise ventilation system capable of providing adequate fresh air to the residents while allowing the windows to remain closed to control noise. So that provides residents within those units with an option. They can have the windows open, or if conditions on Broadway are particularly noisy, they can close the windows and the interior noise standard will be met. This is not an uncommon mitigation measure. In fact, you can see based on this map that there are any number of areas along, again, Napa Road, Broadway, and Sonoma Highway where this condition occurs. Next up, looking at operational noise, the project adjoins 6 single-family homes along its western property line. The 3 building clusters on the west side of the site would be set back 15 to 20 feet from the shared property line, and the setback area would serve as a landscape yard space. There aren't even any first floor access doors on the west facing elevations of those buildings. So this would truly be a landscape buffer area. It would not be used for activities such as, I don't know, barbecues or things of that nature. It's a buffer area. However, there's a portion of the parking lot that would adjoin 2 of the single-family units to the west. That parking lot would have a setback of about 5 to 10 feet. That element of the parking lot is a dead end, so it would not support through traffic movements, but it could create potential noise impacts on those adjoining homes. And so the environmental noise analysis identified a special requirement for a solid fence or wall that would extend 50 feet from the northeastern corner of the site along the northern property line and along the length of the 2 adjoining residential parcels to the west. And the mitigation measure sets forth very specific design criteria that wall would need to meet in order to ensure that parking lot noise is adequately mitigated. And the area of that sound wall is highlighted on the slide that's before you right now. And lastly, with respect to construction noise, the mitigation monitoring program and conditions of approval identify a number of required best practices that would be implemented during the construction process. Construction can be a noisy period of time, especially during the early phases of grading and putting up the building walls. And although it's a temporary condition, it's one that we do want to try to address as best we can. So the conditions of approval call for a number of best practices, including enclosures and mufflers for stationary equipment, locating stationary equipment far from sensitive noise receptors, implementing noise attenuation measures, and identifying a noise coordinator. Now, often in smaller projects, the requirement is simply to comply with the noise standards set forth in the city's development code, which has a specific set of rules and hours for construction activities. But because this is a larger project, we are going above and beyond those normal requirements with the implementation of these different best practices. Traffic is another topic that was addressed in the initial study. Just to review that very briefly, the Broadway and Clay Street intersection currently operates at level of service A, and it will continue to do so with the project both now and into the future. However, red curbing is going to be required at the project driveway to ensure adequate sight distance and to assure that traffic safety isn't compromised. The Broadway segment adjoining the site and a little bit to the north is going to be restriped with a two-way left turn lane. That's basically going to carry through to the left turn lane that's south and north of the site. So this project sits in a gap, and that gap's going to be filled as a condition of project approval. So again, there were a number of areas where the impacts were less than significant. There were also several areas where mitigation was required, but the finding was that the mitigation measures that are identified in the initial study and carried forward into the conditions of approval will reduce those impacts to a less than significant level. A number of these measures are carried forward in the construction management plan. That's a key element in the conditions of approval that includes neighbor and agency outreach and coordination, construction traffic control, the noise mitigation measures that we've discussed, the air quality protection measures that we have discussed, requirements for hazardous materials testing and abatement, and requirements for construction recycling. We would also like to place this project in the context of the City of Sonoma's housing needs. The starting point for discussing Sonoma's housing needs is the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. That's also known as the Fair Share Allocation. State law requires that all regional councils of government, including the Association of Bay Area Governments, to periodically update the existing and projected housing needs for its region at various household income levels, and to determine the portion allocated to each jurisdiction within the region. When these updates occur, state law further requires that affected jurisdictions update their housing element to address the revised housing needs assessment. So based on this most recent set of housing needs assessments, the City of Sonoma, which was issued in 2013, the fair share allocation for Sonoma, which is addressed in our current housing element, adopted in March 2015, is as follows. 24 units are needed at the extremely low and very low income level. 23 units are called for at the low income level, 27 units at the moderate income level, and 63 units at the above moderate income level. And these are floors, they're not ceilings. We're certainly not penalized if we do better, especially in the low and moderate income categories. But traditionally, we haven't done better. Traditionally, we've fallen short. So, for example, in the last housing element cycle, we fell short at the very low income level by 33 units, and at the low income level by 24 units. So we don't always meet these goals. There's no specific penalties in place at this time for not meeting these objectives, but these are planning objectives that are embedded in our general plan and in our housing element. And this project would go a long ways towards meeting some of these key objectives. The Alta Mira affordable project would provide 15 units at the extremely low income level, 19 units at the very low income level, and 9 units at the low income level. And while there are many different types of housing needed in Sonoma, and no one project can or should be expected to provide for all of them, Alta Mira Apartments would clearly address a documented community need by providing rental housing affordable to a group that is in great need of them. And as previously noted, the housing element identifies the site as suitable for higher density affordable housing, and the site was actually acquired for that purpose in 2007. I'd like to briefly review the findings that are associated with approving a use permit and approving a application for site design and architectural review, specifically as related to the project that's in front of you. There are 4 basic findings associated with use permit review. They have to do with general plan consistency, consistency with the development code, compatibility in terms of size, design, and operating characteristics with existing and future land uses, and compatibility with the architectural integrity and character of the zoning district where the project is located. So, as we've discussed, the project, we've evaluated the project very carefully in terms of general plan consistency, including a complete review of policies that is set forth in the findings for use permit approval, and its staff's conclusion that the project complies with applicable general plan policies. In addition, with respect to the development code, the project is in substantial compliance with the applicable standards and regulations. There are certain incentives and concessions that are requested, but those are allowed for under state law. And through that process, they're not considered variances or exceptions. So the project is consistent with the development code. In terms of its location, design, and operating characteristics, we've hit on a lot of this stuff before, but again, the units in the project would be divided among 8 buildings in order to break down the scale and massing of the project. The building heights are generally consistent with those of nearby development. The parking lot has been placed to limit exposure to neighboring residential development, and a sound wall would be required where it adjoins neighboring residences. The project provides a rear yard to rear yard relationship between residential buildings on the west. Also on the west, a number of 1-bedroom units has been located in that area to reduce potential noise conflicts, and the landscaped area on the west would be used as a buffer area rather than for outdoor activities. The project entrance has been placed on Broadway, and the project would be required to restripe a continuous center-left turn lane to ensure traffic safety. We've got mitigation measures that will comply with state and local noise standards, and the ratio of off-street parking provided exceeds the state mandated standard. To further assure that the operation of the project is compatible, an on-site resident manager will be required. So we feel that all of those different elements add up to a project that's compatible with its surroundings. And we've also, in the staff report, previously reviewed the building architecture and how that relates to adjoining development. I'm not going to repeat that here, or in these findings for site design and architectural review. We've prepared complete findings for the project that are attached as part of the staff report, and it's our evaluation that the project complies. So just to summarize, we feel that this project has, and the project applicant have undertaken a sincere and constructive neighbor outreach effort that has resulted in significant changes to the site plan that provide much greater compatibility with adjoining development. It's our view that the affordable housing that's proposed with respect to this project meets an important community need. And it's our evaluation that the project is in substantial compliance with the development code and the general plan. And based on those factors, we're recommending that the Planning Commission take a couple of actions tonight. We recommend that you adopt the attached resolution making findings for a mitigated negative declaration, and that you adopt the attached resolution granting use permit and site design and architectural review for the project, including findings and subject to the conditions of approval mitigation monitoring program. So with that, I'll conclude my report. Happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Any questions of staff at this point? Commissioner Bohar.
Thank you for your report, Mr. Goodison. I have a couple of questions. The Sonoma Valley Citizens Advisory Commission or Committee? Commission.
Commission.
They approved, it was in your report that noted that they approved the project unanimously. What is their rationale for reviewing these kinds of projects? What sort of criteria do they use for making that judgment? I was at the meeting, and Commissioner Coleman was also at that meeting.
Okay. The Sonoma Valley Citizens Advisory Commission is a city-county commission, so it has representatives, citizen representatives from both the incorporated area of Sonoma and different unincorporated areas within Sonoma Valley. With respect to development proposals that are occurring within city limits, it's purely an advisory commission. In other words, it did not approve the project. It could not approve the project. It did make a recommendation for project approval that has been forwarded to you. And the comments of the commission in that regard are summarized in the minutes that were included with your packet. But in terms of projects that that particular commission reviews, under the commission charter, it's intended to review projects that are of valley-wide significance. So it typically reviews larger scale projects for which a negative declaration or an EIR is proposed. But the determination is made by the chair of the commission. So just because a negative declaration has been prepared, an initial site has been prepared, that doesn't mean that the commission will automatically review it. We'll run it by the chair, and the chair will decide if he or she feels that it calls for their advisory review.
Okay. Well, this is certainly affordable housing project. The city is certainly a worthy project, and this organization that's making the application is a very substantial firm. But I think it's worth putting the Citizens Advisory Commission unanimous approval in the right perspective. Commissioner Coleman and I listened to the conversation for the duration of the meeting. Most of it was regarding transportation. There were a lot of laudatory comments made about the need for affordable housing, which I think most people agree with here. There was discussion of public transit, bicycle accommodations, and so forth. After they made their conclusion, though, I'd like to make it very clear here. I think it's important. The charge, and I think this was made by the commissioner, by the chair, but they made it very clear that they were through with their evaluation. They liked the project, they approved it, but they used the word, we want to make it clear that we charge the Planning Commission with vetting this project thoroughly as to its structure and design and its compatibility with the neighborhood and with the appropriate policies and regulations within the city. So I want to make that point that this body has the responsibility beyond whatever they may have said about vetting this in the light of those policies and regulations. My next question, if you would indulge me, regards the parking. 75 spaces has been offered. There are 85 bedrooms in this project, if I am calculating that correctly, with the 48 units. And I see material that we were handed at the meeting tonight, and I've read material that somehow there's a state standard involved here that would overrule the city standard of 90 spaces. Could you clarify that, or could council clarify what the relationship is with the Sacramento oversight here?
Well, I'll take a first stab at it, and I'm sure that our representative from the city attorney's office can weigh in. There's a section in the California Government Code that establishes a parking standard for affordable housing that meets different income levels that this project meets. That code section is cited on page 7 of your staff report. And to summarize the standard, 1 parking space for each 1-bedroom unit and 2 parking spaces for each 2- and 3-bedroom unit. The city, under that government code section, does not have any discretion to require a greater amount of parking, at least as I understand the law. Veronica?
That is generally accurate, yes.
So Sacramento is mandating what the parking is in our community for this kind of project. Is that accurate?
They're mandating it in all California communities. That's correct.
It certainly looks inadequate to have 75 parking spaces for 85 bedrooms. I can't even imagine that the parking is going to be adequate in that area. At any rate, that's for another part of the meeting. My last question, please. Regarding your findings that the development code policy had been fulfilled, I am a neophyte at this with only 6 months on the commission, but I have read the material, and I read this, for example, regarding the Broadway corridor. The grand entrance to the downtown defined by historic structures, landscape front yards, street trees, and it goes on, new development will respect and contribute to the character of the area. How are those fulfilled by this, in your opinion? Is that a fair question at this point in the meeting?
It's a fair question at any point, and I hope that or at least I have certainly tried to address that in the staff report. For example, the staff recommendation is based on going through the different findings associated with project approval, both for the use permit and for site design and architectural review. And so, for example, in your packet, you've got a set of findings that review the project in terms of consistency with the design guidelines for infill development in the Broadway Historic District. Guideline. New development should continue the functional on-site relationships of the surrounding neighborhood. For example, common patterns that should be continued are entries facing the public right-of-way, front porches and garages, parking areas located at the rear of the parcel. Project response. Consistent with the overall development pattern of Broadway and Clay Street, the apartments and community meeting room are designed in place to engage the street. The apartment buildings are designed with doors, windows, and porches facing the street frontages. Along the west side of the site, the project maintains a rear yard-to-rear yard relationship with adjoining residences on Bragg Street, et cetera, and it goes on from there. So my assessment as a staff person is based on looking at the project from one guideline to the next, and then stepping back to see if we feel like it fulfills the big picture. In terms of the big picture, this property is designated as mixed use. It's identified as a housing opportunity site. In terms of its specific components, again, in the analysis that is provided for the findings, we believe that it complies with all of the different findings associated with use permit approval and infill development in the historic overlay zone. I mean, just to name those 2 examples. Now, those guidelines are definitely subjective. So I'm not suggesting that it's not subject to interpretation or question by the public or the Planning Commission. And ultimately, the Planning Commission has to make an independent decision as to whether or not the project fulfills those different guidelines. I'm simply providing the staff perspective.
Thank you. I appreciate, and I also appreciate your noting the subjectivity involved here, because this moves away from specific quantitative standards into the more of the general policy that's very subjective. And I suppose that's the direction I'm going in. My interpretation of the regulations was more based.
Commissioner Bohar, could I ask you to limit this section to questions of staff as opposed to commentary on the project? There will be time and an appropriate time for that, and I think we should hold that until we've received additional input from the public, rather than your interpretation of code at this time.
I would like to pause, but I object to being limited at this point, if you don't mind. Is there a point of order here or something I can appeal to that would make sense? I don't want to waste this commission's time, but I have some things that are important to me right now. I'd like another couple of minutes to vet this.
But I guess I'm saying, is this a question of staff? Because I hear you stating your observation on the qualitative aspects of the project as opposed to asking for specific data points or information from staff. And I just feel like there will be time for that in our discussion this evening at a later point. I'm not trying to block you from making your observations about the project. I'm just wanting to hold them to the appropriate time.
Fine, I'll speak later on that.
Okay, any other questions of staff at this point?
I'd like to bounce off the subject that Commissioner Bohar had about the 75 spaces. Am I to understand that the width of these parking spaces were reduced from the normal 8 feet to another dimension, 7 feet something or 6, in order to accommodate, to make these 75 fit into this?
In some cases, yes.
Right. So that makes opening your door just a little bit tighter. All right.
Other questions?
I had a few, if that's okay.
Go ahead.
One of them has to do with the newspaper article about the project, and also questions related to the abandonment of First Street and our approval. And I just wanted maybe clarification from staff or from the city attorney as to what the status is of that and how that would affect our deliberation of floor area ratio, for example, or density, and if we were to move forward with the project, would this impede our ability to make findings or approve a project if the commission so desired?
Well, the question has been raised as to how big is the property. The property has an area of 1.98 acres. That's been verified through a record of survey that was performed just within the last 2 years. Now, if you look at let's look at this map here. I'm about to show you something called an assessor's parcel map. Right, an assessor's parcel map is not a survey. It's prepared for entirely different purposes. It's not necessarily based on any kind of meets and bounds measuring. And so in this case, we're looking at an assessor's parcel map. It shows this site. And if you can read that, it shows a little label there of 1.53 acres. It also shows this dashed line that's designated as First Street West and as California Street. So that site area that's designated on this assessor's parcel map, I'm guessing, corresponds to the area outside of the paper street, but that's not completely clear to me. But in any event, let's just look at the facts on the ground. Here's the project site. Here's Marcy Court to the north above the Chase Street, Chase receivables. Then you've got two kind of undeveloped parcels, then you've got a mixed-use development. You've got a couple of different planned developments. You can see that all of the developed properties extend into that paper street. And they do that because that paper street doesn't have any legal significance. It's not a right-of-way that the city owns. It's not an easement. It is a remnant that does not do anything to diminish the size, the actual size of the property, which again is 1.98 acres.
Thank you. So I guess the answer is regardless of whether or not it's a paper street or who owns title or what, it doesn't preclude us from making decisions on this particular project.
No, it does not.
Okay. I had a couple other questions too. One, the other questions has to do with the yellow zone on Clay Street that's painted right now along the loading area. I went up and down it several times, looked really hard, but I could not find any sign or posting of what the hours of operation for the yellow zone were. Maybe I couldn't see it, but could you provide clarity? What does the yellow striping mean, and what limitations does that impose on people using that when, say, for example, the hotel is not using its loading zone? It seems to me right now that a significant portion of the that side of Clay Street is designated for loading. So what are the hours of operation for a loading zone in the city of Sonoma, and are they usually posted?
Well, that area was striped fairly recently by the city's Public Works Department in order to prevent or at least minimize conflicts with the use of the loading zone during the times that the dock is in operation and accepting deliveries. I, like you, have not seen any posted hours, and absent posted hours, it's a loading zone 24 hours a day. Now, the dock itself has posted hours. You know, it's not a 24-hour-a-day dock. I think its hours are 7 to 5 or 7 to 6, something like that. So the loading zone could be posted with reduced hours, but I don't believe that it has been, and therefore it's only a loading zone.
Okay. And then the last question has to do with a criteria that either the state of California or the city and the state have with respect to traffic calming on State Highway 12 and Broadway. Throughout the city, we do see crossings where they have illuminated lights. People push buttons and they're able to cross with caution. A particular note would be the one closest to the railroad station housing development on 2nd that allows people to cross West Napa with a lighted pathway. So I was just wondering, what is the criteria that the state uses to establish that type of a pedestrian crossing, and what has the city done to encourage that along State Highway Route 12 in our city boundaries?
Well, the city has experimented with in-pavement flashing lights at a couple of locations, including locations on the state highway, Broadway and West Napa Street. But those in-pavement systems were initiated by the city. They weren't the result of Caltrans saying, oh, we're all of a sudden meeting this certain criteria and therefore we're going to do this. I don't believe that they have such criteria. And I have to say that the Public Works Department does not regard those in-pavement flashing systems as a very successful experiment because they can be hard to see and they're difficult to maintain. With respect to the crosswalk that has been painted near the project site across Broadway, that crosswalk was not initiated by the city. It was installed by Caltrans, and it was installed over the objection of the city engineer, who felt that it was not a good idea, let's just put it that way. But Caltrans was responding to a request from a citizen in that neighborhood, and they do own that right away, and so they installed it.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thanks.
I have one more, James.
Okay, Commissioner Coleman?
One more. David, issues with the loading dock can only be addressed through management practices, and that was a quote you had in the paper. And I was wondering, the Clay Street is owned by the city of Sonoma up to the curb or up to the landscape?
Well, the right-of-way certainly encompasses the sidewalk on both sides of the street.
And when the use permit was allowed back 20 years ago, when they built this lodge on over 9 acres, but didn't incorporate a loading dock per se on their property, was there an arrangement for them to actually use Clay Street as an offloading facility?
Well, if I'm remembering the research that I did quite a while ago correctly, I believe that the use permit for the lodge was amended to allow for that loading dock.
On a permanent basis, or?
Yes, as part of the use permit.
Right.
Okay, anyone else? Staff questions at this time? Okay, seeing none, then I would like to ask the applicant if they'd like to present to commission, and we'll give you 10 minutes for your presentation. Thank you. Please, again, identify name and affiliation for the record.
Absolutely. First, is there a clicker to use? Good evening, Planning Commissioners. Thank you very much for having us here tonight. My name is Adam Cooperman. I'm a project manager with Satellite Affordable Housing Associates and have been working on this project since the Sonoma CDC awarded our organization the opportunity to develop. I'd first like to introduce a couple of my colleagues. From SAHA, joining me is our Director of Real Estate Development, Eve Stewart, project architect Teresa Ballard from Piatalk Architects, and Tim Schramm, the civil engineer on the project from Dopey Associates. Tonight will be a very brief presentation with then time for questions and answers. I'll introduce you very quickly again to who SAHA is. We'll dive into talking about Altamira Family Apartments and conclude with questions and answers. Satellite Affordable Housing Associates, we go by SAHA for short. We're based in Berkeley, California, have over 50 years of experience in dedicated permanent affordable housing in the Bay Area. We currently in our portfolio have 60 plus properties, over 3,000 units, and house low-income individuals, families, seniors, veterans, homeless and formerly homeless individuals, people with disabilities. And we're very, very excited to be selected to build our second project here in the city of Sonoma. What does affordable housing look like? Well, this is a quick picture of Valley Oak Homes here in Sonoma, a 43-unit family development that is beautifully grown with bay-friendly landscape, raised garden beds, a variety of elements that are very welcoming to the families that do live here. A couple more examples of housing that SAHA has built. Arboleda Apartments in Walnut Creek. Every development that we build has features that are built specifically for the resident type that are being served. This is an example of a play area for this family apartments. Harmon Garden Studios, 15 studio apartment Berkeley development. And as you can see, there are elements integrated into all of our developments that are beautiful, they are comfortable, and they are very aesthetically pleasing. It is a way in which SAHA helps to create community assets in the properties that we build for the surrounding neighbors as well as for the residents that live in these developments. In addition, Saha is a full-service holistic nonprofit developer where we not only own and develop the properties, but we also have full-service property management and resident services as a component to our projects. We'll dive into looking at Alta Mira Family Apartments here at 20269 Broadway. I first want to dive into the community process that we have gone through, beginning in February of 2016, meeting with the immediate South Sonoma neighborhood group. Some highlights from this list, I won't go into every detail. 4-meeting community advisory committee that was a stakeholder group of 8 different Sonoma stakeholders, residents, immediate neighbors, and other folks involved in the city that met 4 times to help evolve the site plan, to give feedback, to help really identify areas that could be improved on in the site plan. You can see that we've hosted multiple community meetings to a wider audience, have had community mailings, frequently asked questions sent out to over 200 neighbors, and most recently were presented to the SVCAC group. We'll quickly dive into the original site plan that was submitted in the application in 2015, where there's a couple of things that I would like to call out is the location of the entrance on Clay Street, 61 total parking spaces for a total of, to help support 49 total units, a combination of 2- and 3-story buildings, the location of the community room on the corner of Broadway and Clay Street, and a lower distribution of 1-bedroom units than we will see in today's site plan, where we see an increased number of 1-bedroom units that was changed from direct feedback from the Community Advisory Committee. We also, very early on, changed the entrance of the development from Clay Street to Broadway Street as a traffic mitigation measure opposite of the loading dock, as well as a way to keep Clay Street calm. As David mentioned in the report, we've increased parking spaces by roughly 22% to a total of 75 parking spaces, including 1 space for loading and unloading, which was a suggestion coming out of the last meeting here in front of the Planning Commission. The location of the homes on the west property line were also a direct change from the Community Advisory Commission that did not want to have parking solely along that west property line, as it would be a nuisance, both audio, visual, and environmental concerns that were introduced to us. The buildings have been reduced from 2- and 3-story buildings to all 1- and 2-story buildings. The location of the community room has been shifted shifted from the corner, but still offers a very strong Broadway presence. A total of 48 units as opposed to 49 units are being presented. And overall, we're very excited with the evolution of this site plan. I would like to quickly call up Teresa Ballard, who's going to talk through the architecture. Thank you.
The development standards that we will use for this project will...
Identify yourself for the record, please.
I beg your pardon. I'm Teresa Ballard. I'm with Piatak Architects. We're the architect on this project. The construction standards will be very sustainable. This project will score very high on the Greenpoint rated scale. It will exhibit low water use features, both in the irrigation and landscape selections, as well as the indoor fixtures, solar power generation on site, and highly efficient mechanical systems and lighting systems. Will employ passive cooling techniques such as cross ventilation. seem to do this. Wait a minute. Let's try to the right. The right works. Okay. You've seen these slides already in the staff presentation, so I don't want to spend too much time on these. I'll just point out that we did look to the agricultural buildings in the surrounding areas around town for our inspiration to how to draw on the historical character of Sonoma. Along Clay Street, we reflect the residential nature of this street by breaking down into smaller forms with their individual porches. The gable ends are facing the street in a similar rhythm to the houses further down the street. If you're driving south on Broadway, this is the view that you'll get, where here you see the 3-bedroom townhouses on the right, which will face the internal courtyard behind the community building. Up close into the front porches that you saw on the Clay Street perspective, we have high and low roof elements. We have fences with a variety of materials, wood, siding, in order to create a variety of textures and scales. You saw this was created in response to our last presentation to you. You wanted to see how our proposed roof heights compare to the neighborhood, and we do fit in within the 30-foot zoning requirement. You also wanted to see how the massing compared on the street scale to the homes further west along Clay. So that's the drawing along the bottom. You see our 3 buildings on the right. And then the existing homes on Clay. The box indicates a blow up at the top of the screen. So get a little closer on that. So the 2 buildings in the upper right-hand corner, you see the existing home and our building. We cut a section through that. The clicker is not working anymore. Oh, there it goes. Okay.
You guys are about to run out of time here. So.
Oh, okay. And we have a model left over from our CIC meetings and updated now.
Okay, just a
With
quick
that,
last word, and
we
then
conclude our presentation.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
All right. Do members of the commission have any questions of the applicant at this time?
Yes, I do.
Commissioner McDonald?
So I have a number of questions, and I don't know how best to ask these because there's a lot of them, and a lot of them have to do mostly with operations, but also some site planning issues. So, and it probably has a little bit to do with management, a little bit to do with architecture. So please bear with me. What I'd like to do is try to go through my list, and then maybe you can figure out who is best to respond to these questions. So what we're looking at as a commission is also a use permit, which states that we have to regulate the operational characteristics of this ultimate development. And we need to make sure that it's also compatible with the neighborhood. So that's why I'm asking these specific questions. One of the questions I has to do with the restrictions on the number of persons per bedrooms, and so I wanted to know what that restriction was, and also the number of people per unit. The second question I have has to do with quiet hours. What are they, and are they enforced on site? What I mean is quiet hours, after 10 o'clock, you're not supposed to be making noise. So this has to do with activities outside after hours. The third is, do you have any regulations or restrictions within your group on the storage of personal items and on private balconies and decks that are visible from the street or also visible within the development? Also, do you have restrictions on satellite dishes and antennas from balconies and roofs? So those sorts of items are regulated, or if they are. Does the management at your other sites or at this particular facility have any sort of outdoor security cameras or surveillance on site for after hours? And I also wanted to ask just for clarification, and which has been, maybe I'm reading everything wrong, but I'm still not clear whether or not this is a 49 or a 48 unit development. So it keeps vacillating back and forth between the numbers. I would like clarification on how many units are being proposed. The other question is, do you have restrictions on the on guests staying on site? And also, do you have hours for visitors both day and night? The other question has to do with garbage and recycling. Noted on the site plan is one location for garbage and waste, yet buildings 4, 5, 6 are very far from that storage facility, and particularly depending on the time of the year, could be a very wet travel from going from Clay Street over to that. So I wanted to understand how you address garbage storage within each unit versus each building, and how that's dealt with to accommodate convenience for the people living on site. Also, I had a question about who is responsible for landscape maintenance and cleaning and repair, particularly of the bioswale, since a significant portion of the landscaping is being devoted specifically for storm water retention. Also, how do drains and trees and landscape features, how they're taken care of and over the long term, and who's responsible for this. And from time to time, one management company or property can be purchased and sold to another. So I wanted to understand how the transfer of this occurs over the long haul of the life of the project. Another question has to do with on-site traffic management, planning, and traffic calming within the development. I've traveled and went to the Valley Oaks development that was just built at in Agua Caliente, and also the Firehouse Station development. And it is evident that in these developments, especially with multiple bedrooms, there's lots of children running around on scooters, skateboards, bicycles. And what I want to understand is, and what is not clear in the analysis or the site plan, is what sort of traffic management plan and calming systems that you are going to be incorporating into this development to protect children and seniors. Another question has to do with the private open space in the park for children. I wanted to see if you could respond to how you plan on protecting those areas with gates or fences, or if you are doing that to keep small children and toddlers from running out into the parking lots and possibly into the street. So I know that's a lot of questions, but I think they're pertinent to the operations and the site planning and the livability of the project.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Eve Stewart. I'm with Saha, and I will try to address the operational questions, and there were a couple of things more specific to the site plan and architecture that then I'll have Teresa address. We'll try to get them all. If we forget, please prompt us. Let's see. So in the order that you asked, so you asked about how many people per unit. That is basically set either by state building code or we use HUD. Their guideline is N+1 in terms of the number of bedrooms plus one person can occupy. So in a 2-bedroom apartment, that would be roughly 3 people. Ultimately, it comes down to the total square footage and what's allowed by state building code. This question has been raised kind of throughout the process, and I don't know if we brought the we have some additional information that we have prepared for previous meetings, looking at our current portfolio, what our typical occupancy is in our housing, and what and we had, I think we showed that table at the last meeting, but we roughly have about slightly over one person per unit in one bedroom. We're a little, we're between 2 and 3 on the 2 bedrooms. And then I think we're at about 4.2 in the 3 bedrooms as sort of an average occupancy, looking at our whole housing portfolio that encompasses several thousand homes. In terms of quiet hours, we do have a very strict enforcement of house rules. So, we have a standard lease that all of our residents sign, and we also have specific house rules. So, occasionally we'll have more specific house rules depending on the setting. But one thing that is very fundamental to what we do is that no one shall interfere with the quiet enjoyment of the property. So if anyone is, being noisy after hours or even during, the day, then they'll be cited, and management will follow up with them to make sure that that behavior stops. And if we're not able to work it out, then we would have to begin the process of having that household leave the property. Balconies is another big thing for our house rules. We do not let people store stuff. You can't put your mop and your your suitcases and so forth on the balconies. We did try to pay a lot of attention to that in the design to avoid a situation where someone might be tempted to break that house rule, and then we would have, to kind of work through it. So we rather intentionally didn't put balconies out facing the street and so forth, just to avoid the potential for that kind of conflict to arise. In the event that it does, our management will address it swiftly. In terms of the number of units, we have reduced the total unit count to 48. Our previous proposal was for 49, and we've reduced that now to 48. Guest restrictions. We do not allow visitors to stay longer than 14 days. So we have that clearly in our lease. I think Teresa may have some additional things to say about the location of the trash enclosure and recycling and so forth, but we do have an exterior trash enclosure located in the parking. Residents will need to bring their trash to that enclosure. That's pretty typical for multifamily developments. In our larger, more urban settings, we often have interior trash rooms, trash chutes, and so forth. But at this scale, the exterior trash is what we typically do. Landscape maintenance will be the responsibility of my organization. Our management company will contract with local landscaper who will perform regular maintenance for all the exterior areas. In terms of ownership, our organization, our intent is to be here for another 50 years and to own this building far into the future. We do not sell our housing. We're very proud of it, and we are very committed to our residents. There aren't necessarily restrictions on selling the property, although it's certainly not our intent to do it. And the regulatory restrictions with regard to affordability will run with the land. So in the unlikely event Saha was not the owner, the affordability restrictions would remain. Traffic calming within the development, again, I might have Teresa, if she wants to add anything, come in, but we have looked at different materials that we can use within the parking area to create both the visual and textural change to alert people that they are in a parking area that will have a variety of uses. Of course, we would love to include less parking and more play space, but we understand the concerns about parking. So that's something that we're working on in terms of using color and texture to remind people of where they are and promote traffic calming. And then, again, I think Teresa may have some comments with regard to the fences. It was a discussion in terms of, should this be more open? Should it be more fenced? We can certainly look at adding some fencing in that main courtyard area to avoid any, scary situations with regard to little children. And With regard to the Clay Street side, I think if there are suggestions or preferences in terms of how the fencing should be addressed, then please do let us know. We want the development to feel welcoming, but of course we want it to be secure and not create any safety concerns. We do typically, and we will here, have a security camera system. So we'll have cameras mounted on the buildings so we can keep an eye on vehicles in and out, as well as pedestrians who may come through. Certainly the community building and the offices there will have security cameras. And the community building, as well as the mail and lobby area, will be accessed through a key fob system, so that it will be locked unless you're a resident and you have an electronic key fob similar to what you might have with your car. And through that, we can control the hours of operation for the community room. So at 8 o'clock, we can lock that off, and even if you have a fob, you can't enter. So we will have a lot of those measures in place here. Was there anything else operationally that I missed?
The drop off for residents, especially seniors or disabled that are using paratransit vehicles. Right now, the site plan doesn't really show where somebody could safely let somebody off within the development. So I was wondering if you could address that. At your other sites, some of them have that and some of them don't.
We do have room for the handicap and the handicap van, and then this did come up last time, and so we did designate a parking space near the front entrance that would just be for loading, unloading, so short-term, 20-minute or 10-minute. We could even bring it down to 10-minute, so if you're picking someone up, you just can get them right there.
Okay, yeah, I couldn't see that because I was, okay, but that's in the
It's a
front.
little small,
That's
yeah.
small. Okay, thank
Yeah.
you.
Okay, great. Teresa, did you want to add anything about those items? The fencing, the trash?
We don't have gates. We do have fencing.
Speak in the mic.
I'm sorry. We do have gates. We don't have gates. We do have fencing, though, so that there's only one in and out between building 2 and the community building. Then also, and I'm losing track of my building numbers, but 1, 2. So between buildings 5 and 6, we have a walkway through there as well, but then between 6 and 7, it's fenced. So there's one walkway on Clay and one walkway on Broadway where it's not fenced between buildings. It's not fenced to the parking lot. We have been thinking about traffic calming measures. We are looking at creating an environment that is more like a pedestrian/auto court and not a strict parking lot. We're pinching down the parking lot in places where you see the orange trees, the parking lot pinches down. We don't have curbs, so the transition from the walking area to the parking lots is just a continuation of the courtyard itself. We have curb stops for the cars. The parking lot we're suggesting to be sealed with like chip seal or some other way of coloring it so that it's not just a black asphalt environment. And then the kind of parking courtyard, which works its way down between the buildings, that will be pervious pavement also, so not asphalt.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions? Yeah, Commissioner Bohar.
Mr. Goodison, I'd just like to ask you a protocol question about questions to the applicant. I have a few questions that are in the nature of asking the applicant whether they would consider making some modifications to the project. Is that an appropriate sort of question at this point?
Apparently so.
Okay, Mr. Cooperman, I think these questions would be directed to you, if you would, please. Sure. Just a background. I've been an industrial commercial real estate broker in the East Bay for about 30 years and an investor, and I'm very familiar with your company, and you are to be congratulated on a very strong company with an excellent reputation in Berkeley and other communities, and good staying power, which is important in something like this. This is a very worthy project, and the city certainly needs affordable housing. My concern is more of a policy subjective thing about ensuring that the project is compatible with a specific neighborhood, and primarily those are the people on Bragg Street, in my opinion. And the other element of compatibility is not comparing quantitative things in the area as far as heights and setbacks so much. It's really looking at it for compatibility with the general plan's theme in the Broadway corridor as being a gateway to town. It strikes me that this southern part of Broadway has really been kind of unfolded on its own over a long period of time. Some of those businesses are very old, and it's likely there was very casual zoning and control of development along there 50 or 75 years ago or longer. And it seems like the goal of the general plan is to improve the southern section so that it more or less matches the northern section, where as soon as you get past 4 or 5 blocks to the north, things seem to change. They're more subtle, they're more gracious, the setback, and I'm realizing these places are older, but there's deeper setbacks. And particularly there are rows of standard, what you might call street trees that are fully developed, sycamores, poplars, things like that are kind of what you call handsome street trees. And also along the high school, there's a very handsome row of trees along there, and it provides a very handsome buffer for development along there. And my view of the corridor plan is that the area where your project is being proposed is an area that needs improvement so that it matches and has a consistent view there. And so the things that I'm interested in really are geared to that. You certainly have espoused that you want to have compatibility with the neighbors because you're going to be there for 50 years and you want to have tranquility and peace between the tenants in your project and the neighbors. And this is the time to start that. Would you consider moving these setbacks back to the city standard, because the project that of course contributes to the density and the loomingness of it, but it seems like it's imposing the way it is on 3 sides really. Could that be a consideration to, particularly the community building is right on the street, and it's strikingly different architecture than anything that you might call historic or Sonoma themed to me. The other issue that is more stark to me is the center building on the west. You've got a truncated setback, and I think the neighbors have a rightful complaint about that. They bought those houses with the idea that it was going to be open. I realized it was zoned later probably to mixed use, but is that a consideration to change these setbacks? That's probably going to reduce the density, so that's a tough one, I know.
We did various studies.
Reduce the exceptions to the setbacks, I'm sorry.
Right. We did various studies of looking at where the setbacks would be and the positioning of the buildings, and this was the site plan that we felt most comfortable with, that checked all of the boxes. It allowed the project to maintain a what we thought was a proper density for the site. It allowed the relationship to Broadway, which was an additional component that we heard both from our own CAC as well as from members of the Planning Commission and conversations with city staff about the importance of this project's relationship to the gateway of the city of Sonoma. And that has been translated in both the landscape architecture that's proposed as well as the architecture. And the, I guess the proposed architecture, as Teresa mentioned, was one that was based off of the historical remnants of this specific site, with in essence of agricultural buildings, but a reality that it is a new construction project. I could say that we could have a discussion amongst our design team about a change in the setbacks, as you say, but it was something that was studied, and I can tell you that it was a process that evolved with communication in our CAC group, as well as input from city staff, and this was a site plan that we felt very comfortable with all around.
Okay.
And
Second.
I'll
excuse me.
invite
Can I add?
Eve. Yeah.
I can't help myself. So just to kind of expound on what Adam was saying. So one thing that we looked at, so there's two places really where we are encroaching in the required setback, and one is on that center building on the west side. And so for that one specifically, had many conversations with the immediate neighbors, and there was an interest in seeing that building come down to just one story at that location. And so a compromise that we proposed was, okay, how about we shed the roof down so we'll only have one story of units there, but then we're going to have to scooch the building a little closer to the fence in that setback so that we can maintain the open space and the parking and the overall number of apartments that we're trying to get on there. So that was a trade-off that we evaluated. And then with regard to the setbacks on Broadway, there is and maybe Mr. Goodison can chime in here, but there is a sidewalk easement, or maybe it's a PG&E easement, so that our property line starts beyond so there's the sidewalk, and then there's an easement, or it's either city or PG&E, and then our property line starts. So if we measure from the property line, we are we're short on the setback. But if we measure from the sidewalk, we're much deeper in. And when we were looking at it, we felt that the buildings actually looked kind of funny set so far back. We had this really big no man's land in the front there. So we thought it helped the design to bring the community building forward a little bit. So that's just to add some detail to the process that we went through on the setbacks.
Thank you.
Through the chair.
Yes,
I just wanted to add that if you look at the site plan that's on the screen, you can see a setback notation next to the community building, 9 feet 4 inches.
That looks different than the one that I saw in the package. Is it?
No, it's the same.
Okay.
It's exactly the same slide.
Okay.
So as you can see, that 9 foot 4 inch line corresponds
Oh,
to
I see.
that green
Okay.
area.
Yeah.
And then there's an area beyond, adjoining Broadway that's not incorporated into the landscaping plan. You can see they've left it out of the landscaping plan. That's because that's part of the Broadway right-of-way.
Okay.
So they do have an effective setback that's greater than 9 feet in that area. And again, we can accommodate the 3-lane configuration within that existing condition without pushing the sidewalk in. So as a practical matter, unless Broadway were to be substantially widened within its right-of-way, the effective setback is going to be more like 20 feet than 9 feet.
Related to that, who owns this apparently grassy area between the perimeter line of the buildings and this curb, that yellowish color stuff? Is that city property, or is that?
Well, again, that area is part of the site, but it's within the Caltrans right-of-way.
Is that dirt and grass along there? I mean, is that what that represents?
They're just representing it that it's within the right-of-way, and it's not incorporated into their 1.98 acres.
Okay, well, my question is, could you consider putting a line of regularly spaced street trees on that area so as to provide this kind of veil that is prominent on the northern
Right,
part of the
right.
corridor.
Well, subject to Caltrans approval, yes, you could, and this project will be required to install street trees, and we'd certainly work with Caltrans to try to accomplish that.
Would the applicant consider something like that? I mean, I'm talking about mature street trees, not small ornamentals, and not to have to wait 5 or 8 years for them to provide some coverage. That would soften the street appeal of this property, I
Absolutely.
think, substantially.
Yeah, I think I can say yes, we would consider that.
Thank you very much. I have one further question, and not an easy one, and I'm going back to this parking issue. That seems woefully underparked at 75, particularly given the fact that the city requirement was 90. Is there any solution to that other than reducing number of units? Clay Street is tough to park on. The train town causes a lot of congestion. Parking just seems inevitable that it's going to be a tension issue in the community and between you and the neighbors and other people living down there, office workers and.
Yeah, I can attest to the parking being an issue in any project in any location. So we are continuously monitoring what that looks like. You know, the way in which we arrived to the increase in parking spaces, because initially looking at our very first proposal, including 61 parking spaces, was an initial comfort level that we have. And that was based on monitoring the parking at other similar properties in both the property here in Sonoma, as well as similar properties in similar demographic cities. We did a deeper dive into a parking study once we began the process of really working with the community and understanding that this was going to be a continued concern. The parking analysis that we provided led to an understanding that at 75 parking spaces, this will be one of the heaviest, this may be the heaviest parked Saha property amongst our entire portfolio, looking at both parking spaces in relationship to units and parking spaces in relationship to bedrooms. And this was studied at, again, very similar family properties across our portfolio. You know, it is a family development, so not everybody who's going to be living here is going to be of age or having a car. And we are very comfortable knowing that, based on the study we completed, that we think 75 parking spaces will be sufficient for the number of households that will be housed here.
So that's primarily based on the fact that you're going to have a lot of young children who aren't of driving age? Is that what I'm getting here?
No, I mean, it was looked at based on the actual parking demand at housed properties, housed family properties across our portfolio.
Okay, well, I guess the future will tell. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Anyone else?
I have a question.
All right, Commissioner Sack.
I have another parking question, but this may be addressed by David. So 75 parking spaces are proposed, and 23 of those spots are allocated to the 1-bedroom, 26 to the 2-bedroom, and 12 to the 3-bedroom. Commissioner McDonald had inquired about Firehouse Village, and the ratio of spaces per unit there are 1.43 per unit.
Correct.
So has there historically been any issues with parking and overflow with that particular project?
Not that have been reported to the planning department.
And that doesn't include visitor parking, is that correct?
The 1.43 parking ratio that exists at Firehouse Village represents the total amount of parking on the site.
Thank you.
Commissioner Coleman, you have any questions?
Yes, the architect was explaining to us the green aspects of the architecture and cross ventilation, and I was a little curious about the buildings 4, 5, and 6 on Clay, which I'm to understand because of the decibel levels of noise that they may encounter on the loading dock. Their solution would be to close their windows and turn on the forced air or the air conditioning when and if those events occur. And I thought, well, that doesn't seem fair to the other residents who don't have to endure the ongoing debate about the loading dock and the issues that it brings to Clay Street. Also, the solar panels, which will be on all the buildings except 1 and 8, was that correct?
I think it's 6, 7, and 8.
There will be solar panels on 6, 7, and 8.
6, 7, and 8 will not have solar panels facing the homes to the west.
But they will have them on the east. Will all the buildings have solar panels, my question is?
We haven't got to that stage yet where we have worked with an electrical engineer to identify exactly how many solar panels yet, so I can't definitively answer that. I know that I can say we're definitely not putting them on the western facing slopes on 6, 7, and 8.
Because of the glare.
Yeah. Title 24 now does incentivize solar panels. So for energy efficiency, it does give credit for on-site power generation using photovoltaics. So it's very likely that there will be solar panels on most of the other buildings.
Right,
Mm-hmm.
likely. But if not, then how would those residents, if for any reason they don't have access to the same voltage, free energy that the others
No,
have?
the solar panels would be there would be net metering that would if
It would be distributed.
That's right.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Because normally there's a dedicated line to, that meter for that building, but you would be
Right.
able to, because I asked a lot of different contractors about the nature of solar panels on the roof, if there was an option of solar panels on, say, covered parking.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's no covered parking, whatever, for budgetary reasons, there's no covered parking in Valley Oaks or on this project. But throughout the school districts, they incorporated covered parking with solar panels to help offset the energy woes that everybody has. So and it seemed like their argument was that it's obviously easier to mechanically deal with panels if they're on a one-story covered parking. If you have issues with roof repairs, obviously there's going to be a life to a roof, being it's going to be maybe composite asphalt tile, most likely.
Right.
So, everything comes with a warranty. So, 55 years, you're probably looking at having to replace that roof at least once, which means contractors have to come in and remove the solar panels because that's not normally a roofing job. So there's expenses involved. Or if there's, God forbid, a fire. Firemen cannot cut a hole where there's a solar panel. They can only cut a hole where they have room. So that's become a real issue in the state because of the amount of solar panels that are being incorporated into buildings now. But even a repair, you have to remove that panel in order to do a roof repair. So it just seems to make more sense in the long term to that if you had covered parking, you could have that whole northern edge, all solar panels, with a grid to, with an even grid to distribute to all the. So it was just a thought. I had another question about the neighbors on Bragg Street. They did their petition, and it was pretty unanimous. It was that they all agreed there should be we're calling it a sound wall. Now, it's not a privacy wall because that's different, And again, I researched what a true definition of a sound wall is, And because a wooden fence is being thrown out there as what's going to be built to help the residents on Bragg Street have combination of privacy and sound. And they say that a true sound wall really isn't effective unless it's 12 to 15 feet high and built of masonry materials. Again, if you choose a wooden fence and it is built to the height standards of maximum 8 feet, and again, if you own it for 55 years, and most fences are going to have a life of give or take 15, 20 years, you're probably going to have to replace that fence. And again, accrue cost that is going to have to be dealt with down the road. So, I know the argument was, well, we're probably going to build a wood fence, but I would I want you to maybe think about a masonry fence, a true sound fence, and actually built maybe before the construction even begins so that they have some barrier to shield them from the 18 months of construction that they'll have to deal with. So I wish you would consider that.
Okay, another question from Commissioner Sack.
I have a question for the applicant. What's the percentage of units that are dedicated for veterans or those over 55? Is there a minimum?
At this point, there's no age restriction to the project, so there will be no units set aside for any resident of any age group. The veterans component to our project was and still is a planned way in which we can house a subset that is in need of a lot of housing right now. There's state funding specifically tied to housing veterans, and in our initial RFP response, we proposed having 10 units dedicated for veterans, and that is currently still a plan for the project.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I just have a couple questions myself. I want to go just a little bit further into the solar issue because that was a question of mine. So I think I understand you're talking about whatever solar would be there is kind of a net distribution, probably through some proportional thing. Do you currently have solar in any of your existing projects?
We do.
We
yes.
do. And so and there's no lease fee or anything to the is there an additional charge to the unit or?
There's no, our preferred way to do solar is that we purchase the system and install it. So there's no lease or power purchase agreement with an intermediary. We do have a couple of those on some of our older buildings. It was a way to retrofit our older buildings in a cost-effective way. But in this case, we would purchase the system, install it as part of construction, and then there would be no charge to the residents. We have had success doing net metering, which Teresa mentioned. We have that at Valley Oak. So we're able to distribute the savings back to all of the households. You know, they each get the same credit based on the surplus of energy that's being created.
Okay. And then back on this sound wall issue, because I know in the project description it talked about, I think 1-inch board on board and attenuating, I think, by 10 decibels. I just wanted to be clear, that's along the entire western perimeter and northern perimeter that you would do board on board with 1-inch material is what's proposed?
That's correct. That's the way the staff has recommended,
Okay.
my understanding.
Great. All right. Those are my only questions. Thank you. All right. Anyone else with questions before we open it to the public? Great. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, commissioners. This time I'd like to open the meeting to public comment. Again, limit your comments to 3 minutes. Please identify yourself by name and address for the public record. And if you just want to kind of queue yourselves up so we can move along efficiently, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Commission members, staff. My name is Ted Sexauer. I live at 12 Hacienda Drive in the city of Sonoma, and I serve currently as the Veteran Service Officer veterans of foreign wars, post 1943. Now I'm very interested. I've just taken over this post in lieu of a man who held it very honorably for a long time and has moved out of state. So I'm short on information, and so I'm seeking information as to exactly how this will be regulated, how will it be assured, and whether I can have some sort of assurance in writing as to exactly what the plan is. So I ask that of the council or of the applicants. Thank you.
Linda Corrado, First Street East. I would like to answer some of your questions that the applicants also answered, just to reinforce some issues. First of all applicants are extremely vetted, and it's a long process, and it's third-party verification. So all applicants are vetted. And once they become a resident, they have a lease and the house rules, and they must sign both the lease and the house rules. And in the house rule, it addresses most of the issues, Commissioner McDonald, that you raised. And they must sign it, and they must adhere to it. And it's up to the management to enforce it. And I have no doubt at all that Saha will manage this property with the utmost professionalism and adhere to the rules, because it's their reputation at stake ultimately. And I had 34 units with less than a 20-foot setback, with neighbors' houses right behind us, with a broken down wooden fence that needs to be repaired, Mr. Haig. And there was no problem. There was no issues with the neighbors in the back, and no sound issues at all. And the sound that is enforced at night. And we did install in security cameras and lights so that everybody was well protected. So I have no doubt that this project meets the needs of the community. And I think we need to really make sure that this gets approved. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Next.
Good evening. My name's Jim Karabochis. I'm a 72-year resident here. I know the whole area because I own one of the four corners. This part that you're looking at was a 12-acre parcel. It belonged to my brother-in-law's family, and they sold 10 acres in 1990, and then the city bought when Dave Goodison told you about it. I have a question to you, Dave, first. Did you say there'd be no parking on Broadway? It'd be red zone?
I think what we would want to do through the chair is we'll just make a list of questions, and then we'll try to go through them at the end of the public hearing, if
I
that's
think
okay.
that makes the most sense.
Is that
Yeah,
okay?
so we'll do that. Yeah, it's
Okay,
more
I didn't know
efficient.
whether
Yeah.
you had said
Yeah,
that.
no,
But
so I'm going to record the question, but since I am talking, I'm just going to say no.
Okay.
It would just be 20 feet of
Sure.
red curb on each side of the driveway.
Okay. I'm really concerned about the parking. Number one is you have so many in the place, but you're going to have guests, and they're going to have cars. And you're not going to have you're going to have, say, a guest, you're going to have more than one car, I'm sure. The crosswalk that Caltrans put in is pretty stupid. You walk from the west side, and sometimes there's cars parked there on a Sunday. And where do the people go? They're not going to walk in the car. So now they're on the highway. I think also you have an open ditch in front of Train Town. That needs a big culvert. It has to be filled in. But I know Caltrans has been doing a lot of surveying from beyond my house down past Four Corners up, because I talked to them the other day. They said they're going to redo the pavement all the way up and out past over to Boy Springs. So it's time that if this project goes in, that this corridor right down in here should be striped properly and made correctly. I like the idea about the trees, but across the street at Train Town, when the city brought all the rest of the trees down, as you notice, he cut them and they're like poles sitting out there. He destroyed those trees. So there was something else I wanted to mention to you, but I guess that's it. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Jeremy Lawson, I live on Friar Creek. I just want to say that I believe this project's going to kill the neighborhood. It's not necessarily about what the project is per se, the residents that will be there, it's the size of the project. If I knew when I bought my house on Friar Creek that there was an apartment complex going to be built on this property, I would not have bought my house. It's very interesting to me that if you drive to the north end of Braga Street, you'll see a sign at the end of the street that states that this street may go through in the future at the discretion of the city or other future developments. There was never a sign put on that piece of property that this was going to be an apartment complex, much less that it was going to be low income. I find that interesting, and we all know why that sign is on the north end of Braga Street, because of litigation measures in the past. We definitely need additional parking on this property. It's been mentioned several times. The additional parking is needed because it's going to kill this neighborhood if we don't have it. The folks will find themselves parking on Clay Street and then driving through the rest of the community, either to get out to Leveroni or making their way north up Friar Creek, out Newcomb to get back onto Broadway. To see an increase of perhaps maybe as many as 40 cars is what I would estimate we could see with the parking spaces that are as limited as they are. That would absolutely kill our neighborhood out there. We already see a tremendous amount of traffic in the mornings because of congestion on Broadway due to the high school and the middle school traffic. I think that the Saha's answer related to parking out there is related to the fact that their properties are located in the Bay Area, not necessarily Sonoma. They do have one here. Those properties, I would take a guess that they're located in much more, in communities that are much more connected with public transportation than Sonoma is. And I think that's probably a reason why they see fewer cars at those other developments. I agree that the project looks nice, but essentially it sticks out like a sore thumb. It's completely disjointed from the rest of the community and all of the other projects around it. And at the end, I'd like to ask a question about, because I haven't heard anything about it, how many spots or units are allocated for public service employees to the city of Sonoma and or school district employees? Right now, based on the numbers that I saw tonight, none of their salaries are going to make them eligible for this. But if we do a project of this size, it needs to be needs to work for those types of people, so that way the city is actually getting a benefit if we do have some sort of natural disaster. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Fred Allebach at 19550 8th Street East. I'm here to speak in support of this project, and I'd like to note that I was on the Community Advisory Committee, and that I qualify to live at this project, and I would like to live at this project. There was a number of neighbors who were on the Community Advisory Committee, and I felt like it was a good process and that it went well. I'd like to note that the project meets critical and RENA documented housing shortage needs. It addresses backlog of affordable housing and in the housing element and in reality. There's a tremendous need for affordable housing, and this project addressed that. So I did a Google Earth flyover of the area, and even on the maps tonight, the density and the height is exactly the same as for Clay Street and the surrounding area, or even less. Some of the buildings on Clay Street are just right on top of each other. So the question of setbacks seems to me to be kind of a moot point when you look at all of the houses around the neighborhood there. So I don't see that that's really an issue. Saha has made changes to satisfy the comments and suggestions of the neighbors. The noise is similar to Napa Road and Highway 12. As for the issue of the sound wall, I wonder why there wouldn't be a sound wall around Bockley Place or any other development. I don't see that a block wall is even in keeping with anything in Sonoma, and Sonoma is perfect for all these nice redwood fences with the lattice around them, and no one has ever said that they want a block wall between different developments. So I think that there's really no precedent for that in Sonoma, and I don't see why there would be one here. If I'm living there, I'm not going to keep my stereo up loud or whatever, so I don't think that a block wall is really necessary, that there's any provision that the people who live there would be any noisier than anyone else, or that they would put their dirty laundry out more than anyone else would. So overall, the project conforms to all the parameters, all the applicable parameters, and is compatible with all the necessary thresholds. So I think that Saha and staff has hit a home run here, and I think it's a great project, and I encourage you to go with the negative declaration and grant the use permit tonight. Thanks.
Thank you. Next.
My name is Julie J., and I live at 783 Garland Avenue. I've been here for probably the last 15 years. I just want to briefly say that I support this project and definitely support having low, moderate, and very low income housing in our city, and I think it's important to have that kind of housing in areas just like this. And to me, when I walk by there and look at what's already there, I feel like it does really fit well with the surrounding area, and I hope that we can, get it going, because I think we are in dire need of it. That's it.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, my name is Julie Leitzel. I live on Newcomb Street, and I'm not against this project, but I am wondering if the development and the management is not allowed to give preference to Sonoma neighbors or people living in Sonoma, then it really is not meeting an important community need at all. I understand there's a federal law that prevents giving preference to people who already live and work in the community, and if that's true, I think this project should not be represented as fulfilling a need for Sonoma residents. And I do object to the density. I agree with Commissioner Bohar about having it reflect more the character of the community, setbacks. We all have to live within our setbacks as community members when we apply for our remodeling permits. And I'd like to see the zoning regulations, whether it's mixed use, whether it's setbacks, be adhered to. And we don't measure ours from the street, we measure it from the lot line. I think it is too dense. I think that 20 units per acre might have been the original zoning, and it's over that. I don't think the Clay Street development was 20 units per acre. So I'd like to have it look more like, the Harmony development that's in Berkeley. More low slung, more Sonoma. Thank you.
Good evening, Commissioners. My name is Robert Demler. I live on First Street West in Sonoma. The city, these are good comments from the public and the good questions from the Commission. Thank you very much. Sonoma does need something like this. I do think it should be for Sonomans, but maybe there's some restrictions. I agree with the comment about the covered parking and the solar panels. And because at the fire station development, it's a jumble of cars inside. I mean, I made a snide remark once, it's an instant slum. I think people will take pride in the venues where they reside, if the venues themselves have some character and design character and something to be proud of. And I think I don't know how it pencils out for the developer, but it seems to me it's too many units, too few parking. And I totally agree with Commissioner Bohar on the trees along Broadway. We are trying to make Broadway a very, very fine welcome to Sonoma, and there is a very definite delineation between the treed Broadway and the untreed Broadway. It's a real jumble in the south end. So I really would recommend dealing with the tree aspect somehow with Caltrans, and it should be a requirement. Thank you very much for listening.
Good evening. Ann Colachitas, 14 Hacienda, Sonoma Valley Housing Group. I encourage this commission to do something historic tonight and do what's necessary to move this project forward. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Deborah Dato, and I live at 1290 Bragg Street. I want to first say that I'm very much in support of affordable housing. I think it's very important for a city like Sonoma in order for us to remain viable and to have a diverse community. My concerns really are about the size of the project and the impact of the project on residents living there, both the current folks as well as the ones who will live there in the future. My goal tonight is to be very factual in my presentation. I was a member of the Community Advisory Council, and what I came to know is that occupancy in this building, in this development, with 48 units, one-bedroom apartments can have 3 people living in it, two-bedroom apartments can have 5 people living in it, and 3-bedroom apartments can have 7 people living in it. And that's for a total of 234 individuals living in that development. I'm not saying that's who will be there, but that is the potential. One thing that I think is very important is, and people have mentioned it before, is resident preferences. There's no preference for people who are living or working in Sonoma. There was just an article, a great article in the IT talking about a woman who was anonymously named Juliana, who lives in Boyce Hot Springs. She lives in a carport, I guess, that's been remodeled and on a concrete floor, and she works in Sonoma. She has no preference over somebody who lives in Santa Rosa and works in Healdsburg. I just think environmentally it makes so much sense to have people who live here, work here, living in the community. The lodge does not need to be a good neighbor. I know that from living across from them for 16 years. They're a corporation driven by profit, and they're based on what they do is based on what the general manager really will allow. So this is the densest development in the valley. Pollution is dangerous to everybody, no matter how much money you make. Noises, contaminants, the air you breathe, the rancid odors that you would smell. The city mentioned affordable housing in needing them in all income levels, and HUD recommends that a wide mix of income levels makes the most successful projects. I'm not really sure why we're focusing on only 3 or 4 categories and not the wide range of income categories. I just want to conclude with saying that all of the neighbors believe that the buildings on the western border should start out as 1-story buildings going to 2-story buildings, like I believe it's building number 7. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hello, Logan Harvey, 578 Estamadera Drive. I'm in strong support of this project. The general plan calls for it. The development code calls for it. The climate action plan calls for it. All of them call for higher density developments along traffic corridors and areas where there are access to public transportation, and that's exactly what's represented here. Affordable housing, kind of, especially in areas like Sonoma where property values are so high, where just a small lot of land is extremely expensive, are kind of necessitated to be higher density. And that's just a reality of affordable housing. And I think it's important that we start to recognize that we're calling for these things in the general plan, and now these projects are going to start to be implemented. And they may not be a project that every single person loves, but they are projects that serve the community. Actually, teachers were brought up, and teachers start at $47,900 at the Sonoma Valley High School for a brand new teacher. And I think they would qualify for some of these housing projects, especially if they had children. And I think that would be important to recognize. As far as people not expecting new housing development to be near them, every house in Sonoma started as an empty lot. Many of the projects near this were built in the 2000s, which is relatively recent development. And I don't think it's right to expect that empty lots always stay empty lots. One of my goals for Sonoma is to retain the hillside, to retain the natural areas that surround here. And the only way that we can do that and allow people that work here to live here is to build higher density buildings inside of the city limits. If we want to start expanding the UGB and going out into those native lands and taking over people's properties or buying new lands, and we can do that. It's not something that I think is the right plan for Sonoma. I think that having density increase slightly is a good idea. Setbacks have been mitigated on the west side by having no windows on that side, by planting trees on that side that would mitigate people's ability to play on the side of the building there. As far as setbacks towards Broadway, I don't know. I think 49 units is a better goal than sycamore trees, personally. And I think it's more important that we have housing for people that literally cannot afford to live anywhere in Sonoma County than it is that we have some trees on Broadway. And if the trees sacrifice even 2 units, then it's not worth it to me. I'm born and raised in Sonoma. I can't live here. That's the reality.
Thank you. Next.
Rosalie Myers, Cooper Street, one of the neighbors. It's not the fact that this is affordable housing that I object to it. It's the fact that it's 48 units. It's just too dense for this site. It's too dense for Sonoma. It's more dense than anything else. I don't understand why Burbank Housing only proposed 39 units and they were going to make it economically feasible. I haven't heard an answer to that question, but at any rate, sorry. Traffic and people and safety is already an issue on this Four Corners area. Gary Edwards joked at the council meeting where they gave money, he never goes to that area on the weekends because it's so crazy and jam-packed with people and there's safety issues. Well, that may be funny to him, but it's not really fun to the neighbors or the general population of Sonoma. You don't want to go somewhere because it's not safe or too congested. That doesn't make sense to me. And I haven't seen any information about what the impact would be on our schools or our local fire and police services to date about this project. Again, I just think it's too dense and we need to take a closer look. It can be there, just maybe less dense. Thanks.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, William Cooley, 226 West Spain Street. I also grew up here in Sonoma. Had many friends who've struggled to find a place to live. When I returned to Sonoma 3 years ago, it was immensely difficult to find any apartment. And at the time, I felt like I was making reasonable money, money that would have probably put me at the high end of this housing development. I would just want to speak in support of the project. I think that the city of Sonoma needs to address its reallocation. This is a very positive step forward toward that. I believe that diversity of all kinds is important, certainly economic diversity. To address some other comments or criticisms related to density, I would say that there will be no shortage of applicants for these units. Homes that are too small may be too small for an individual, but when you have nowhere else to live, when your income does not allow you to live in a single-family home, you will be very grateful and happy to have a nice new home to live in. In terms of safety, I would encourage the commission to obviously look at other ways to address traffic safety in the area. I would also encourage the developer to examine possible creative solutions to parking. I don't know if they've reached out to Traintown. Their parking lot is empty 4 days a week because they're not open Monday through Thursday. They're closed at 5 p.m. Saturday or Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Just a suggestion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, Gail Miller, 162 Clay Street in Sonoma, and I'm a Southside neighbor, obviously. I really encourage you to approve of this project in a less dense way. The parking, I mean, when he says Traintown is closed 4 days a week, he hasn't been down there all summer long, and every holiday throughout the year when people come up Clay Street and park all the way down. And then they cross Highway 12 to get over to Traintown. It's just a matter of time. That crosswalk, it's just awful because it either gives people a false sense of security or it's just going to be asking for trouble. Anyway, I hope you will come to some decision, some ideas about the parking. I think that's the major thing. Yes, I would love to see this development be less dense. I think there are some real problems with it. I am not against affordable housing. I certainly understand the need for that. I hope you will come to some answers. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Hello, name is Jeff Honeycutt, 27 East Napa Street, and I just want my voice to be heard in support of this project and any sort of new housing we can get built. And in my view, density is a good thing. As Mr. Harvey stated, it's in the general plan, and that's the whole point of infill, is more dense housing. I do understand the concern with parking, and I definitely have that same concern. There's always trouble at any apartment complex I've ever lived, and Sonoma's definitely no exception for that. However, as I said, the density is fantastic, and as far as the safety concerns and trees and whatnot, yes, but there's also the fact that there is no perfect project. If there was a better space for this, I think it would have been built by now, but Sonoma's running out of space, and we have a lovely 2-acre lot on the highway, and I think we need to use it and use it to the best use of the community we can, which is a large amount of housing to help mitigate the crisis we're seeing. Thank you.
Thank you. Any additional comments from members of the public? Seeing none, yeah. When we open it up to for commission, and I want to give him a chance to address any of the questions that were raised. So we'll do those first, and then because some of your answers, some may get answered. All right. Then at this point, I'm going to ask staff if you have a list of questions from some issues that I know were raised. I've got one or two if you don't cover them already.
Great. And I'm trying to focus on things that were specifically raised as questions. All right. And I'm certainly happy to answer other questions that come up based on the comments, but just to look at the ones that I wrote down as specific questions, how many units are allocated to city employees or school district employees? The answer to that is 0. That would A, not be legal, and B, not be popular, I imagine. Can there be a preference for those who live or work in the city limits of Sonoma? The answer to that question is no. Under federal law, that's not possible. We do have a preference condition of approval, but it is based on living and working in Sonoma County. We believe that that is likely to be defensible, but a preference based on city limits would not be, it's just not legally possible. Let's see. Information on school and fire impacts. Those topics are actually addressed in the initial study. Under state law, the payment of school impact fees mitigates impacts on schools. That's what school impact fees are designed to do. This project would pay school impact fees. This project has been evaluated by the Sonoma Valley Fire and Rescue Authority, both in terms of how it is designed and also in terms of impacts, just generally speaking, on their operations. And they found that it was appropriately designed to meet their standards in terms of access, and that it would not have any significant impact on their ability to provide fire and emergency services. That's it.
Great. You covered the ones I had. Commissioner Bohar, you had another question?
Mr. Goodison, you made it very clear about the inability to limit this to Sonoma residents. I had the impression almost everybody that spoke in favor of this project was under the assumption that we were doing a service to our community and improving our demographics and our much-needed workforce housing. That sounds like it is not the case. So is there any way of knowing what the likely mix of residents and non-residents would be in something like this?
Well, I certainly, just as a staff person, dispute that conclusion. I think that the development of affordable housing definitely fulfills a community need, regardless of any preference program that might be possible. This is a site that is within the city limits of Sonoma, and it's going to be most attractive to people who live and work within Sonoma and Sonoma Valley. They will naturally be applying to live in this project if and when the time comes that it is developed. So I think that, there's, just by virtue of its geographic location, that does tend to get sorted out in favor of people who live and work locally. That said, and it's been a while since I've looked at this, we did do a follow-up survey several years ago of a affordable ownership project on Napa Road, and found that a large proportion of those who ended up residing in that project lived and or worked within Sonoma Valley. In any case, as you stated initially, there is no legal latitude in this regard. And so if the decision is to say that if there can't be a local preference, it's not good enough, then affordable housing just doesn't get built within city limits. And that, I think, definitely doesn't serve a community need.
David, there was one other question. I was just going through my notes in that too, that I think maybe someone from Saha, if that is, and that was the question asked about how the veteran preference program might work.
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes, that would be best answered by Saha.
Yeah. So if you could, if you can kind of just give a brief description of, I know you said it's a state mandated program and how that might work.
Correct. It is a program that is not set yet, and it will. It's a competitive application process. So in order for us to apply for the funding of the project must be approved as a prerequisite. The way in which the program works is that as the owner operator of the development, we would be partnering with a veteran-specific local organization. Part of that competitive process is based on the selection of the partner by which you form that partnership with. And so the selection process is in coordination with the state agency that is monitoring this, as well as with the local veteran group that would be partnered with to select residents and to be able to provide very specific needs for those residents on a local basis.
Okay, thank you.
Can I follow up on that, veterans?
Sure.
Adam, so these veterans who may have been homeless in the past and have had a pretty rocky transition, so they're going to need to have their monthly, services through the VA. I imagine Santa Rosa would be the closest. Do you know if there's a dedicated, if they don't have a vehicle and local transportation, maybe their handicap needs might be impaired, is there going to be a paratransit available for them? And will that be provided as a service rather than out of pocket?
Again, because this isn't solidified yet, I can only answer based on other projects that we have built, and the way in which we handle those are through very well identified resident needs, and based on the partnership between the Veterans Organization and SAHA, which does operate transportation services, there would be a coordinated effort to provide those residents with transportation needs to get to the appointments that they do need.
One more question.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, Commissioner McCollum.
One of the people in the audience had made a comment about, I think it was Burbank Housing, and they apparently made a bid. They submitted their RFP for this site, and it included 39 units. And there was a statement that for Saha, the 48 units were for the economies of scale. So how was it that it was feasible for Burbank to come in with 39 and be able to more or less make a profit? And you needed 48 in order to have a return. Was it because, I know there's a mandate, the city has to have so many affordable housing units built by a certain time frame, 2023 or something. So I wasn't sure if maybe they were able to just get all their ducks in a row on one project, or was there other factors?
I cannot speak for Burbank Housing, and definitely can't speak for the rationale behind their financial projections. I do know that through analysis of our project, we had initially suggested 49 units, and we analyze these projects both on a feasibility level of feasibility, but also on the ability to provide high quality housing to the most people that makes sense. So for us, it's a combination of financial feasibility and being able to create a high functioning feasible project. And we thought we were able to do this without maximizing the entire 35% density bonus as well.
Is that it for Commissioner's questions at this point? Okay. No? You just have another?
I just had one more. I was able to at Valley Oaks, there's a permeable asphalt situation over there, and it seemed to have something to do with, it's very critical that they have a proper mix when they mix this asphalt to make it permeable. And there has been some issues over there. I asked about how things were cleaned up over there, and it has to be they had to contract a special vacuum machine. And I was a little concerned about noise decibels, but it didn't seem to be too much of a factor. But the fact that the permeable asphalt is already beginning to crumble, there was some kind of connection with the city mandated the mix, the type of ingredients. So I'm not sure all the factors, but eventually the pieces are going to become potholes and it's going to have to be repaired or replaced. And I was wondering if you could enlighten me on that. And would there be an upgrade to this project to make sure that there won't be any issues with the permeable asphalt, which will make up a big portion of this project?
Well, with regard to Valley Oak, we did use the permeable asphalt, and that was a way to meet our stormwater requirements. And it is higher maintenance, and it is a softer material. So, and it's relatively new. It's starting to be used in more and more in public spaces. Some city sidewalks are using it. But I think, as we move into this project, we'll evaluate, how much permeable asphalt we should or need to use to meet our stormwater requirements, and look at the mix and look at the new technology as it evolves, as it is kind of an emerging technology, and it's still getting worked out.
Okay. All right. I'd like to turn it over for commission discussion now. Commissioner Coleman, since you last had the floor here, I'll just start with you.
Okay, I have a few comments and then I'll have a statement. I support affordable housing. I grew up in affordable housing in San Francisco, so I'm very familiar with density and I just, to me it goes back to, unfortunately, what happened 20 years ago with a certain commission that approved a use permit to allow that lodge to have no loading dock on their property, on over 9 acres of property. So they have created, it's still reverberating to this day, that decision has just caused nothing but a headache for the people on Clay and in the neighborhood, and the effect it has had on parking. And it has just been a real thorn in my side that nothing has ever been able to, I was able to confirm that we as a city own the street, but we can't change the use permit that was allowed the lodge to operate, offloading their trucks on the, so I mean, short of having our planning director or the highest position in town, the mayor, actually send a formal letter to the management or to the corporation to help them understand that in maybe in a short period of time, you're going to have maybe up to 200 people, a community living right across from your loading dock. And you may want to maybe address it in order to maybe keep bad publicity from coming your way. So I think a little more pressure from City Hall would be appreciated. And maybe we as a commission can maybe mandate that, because nothing else seems to be getting done concerning the loading dock and the lack of it. It's just a real pet peeve of mine. I think restriping the curb is a Band-Aid. It does nothing to really address the issue, and especially the safety issue of the residents that are going to be living very close to the edge of the the setback is going to be reduced, or they're asking for exceptions, so they're going to be that much up close and personal to the trucks and the jackknifing and the double parking and the diesel emitted. I just have a real problem. I myself work in a firehouse, and diesel particulate matter is the #1 cause of cancer. And it is a airborne, just causes mayhem. We have devices to help suck it up, and we mop every day, and it's black soot every day in the bucket. So I'm very concerned about the southwestern winds that are going to carry it right into their windows. That is, if there's no noise that day, so they can actually open their window. We've been asked to approve the initial environmental review and a negative declaration studies provided to us from the developer. And it is our responsibility as a planning commission to see that all the projects in Sonoma receive a thorough review, including this one. I am in favor of affordable housing in Sonoma, but I have major concerns for the occupants that will be living in these rented apartments. I don't think the developer has met the city's standard level of environmental impact studies and in meeting this obligation. And I feel we need more in-depth studies and perhaps some site design changes before we can approve a use permit, a site design, and a negative declaration for this project. I will not be approving these resolutions. Traffic and noise are my major design concerns, although there are other environmental reports that appear to be missing or lacking. Both studies were not done at peak time levels and was for a very short duration, 1 day. I question whether they would be acceptable for any other large project in the city. The traffic study should have included the large loading dock and made recommendations for minimizing its impact on the traffic flow and parking on Clay Street, adjacent to the rental development. I'm not a traffic expert, but I've seen enough photos and actually seen actual trucks making deliveries to the lodge, and they do block traffic. We expect the apartment occupants to park their vehicles on Clay Street opposite that dock, so there needs to be a plan to improve the safety for these families. The loading dock needs to be studied as part of the traffic study report, which should include a safe maneuvering space for these trucks and other specific recommendations, including removing and re-engineering that loading dock so that the trucks can actually pull up on their property. It would mean relocating some sheds and other debris that is just thrown there with no intention of serving any purpose other than gathering clutter for the lodge. Noise and its detrimental effect on the health of the families of the Alta Mira apartments is my major concern. The limited noise study indicated the noise generated along Broadway and Clay is not at an acceptable level and will need to be mitigated by design. The report's recommendation was to have the occupants of most of the apartment buildings keep their windows closed. This means they will need air conditioning to deal with the rising hot temperatures in Sonoma. We all know this is not practical, and they will keep their windows open whenever they can. How about on spare the air days or when there's a power grid overload and they can't turn on their air conditioning? Are they going to still have to close their windows in order to keep the noise level out of their room? The report is incomplete and it needs to offer better mitigation options. My question is, the professionals should have known traffic noise was going to be a problem, and why wasn't it dealt with before it got to our commission? There is a serious question whether this site, as designed, is suitable for this project. There needs to be further study of the noise problem and if the project can be redesigned to provide a safe and healthy environment for its occupants. I do not want to be responsible for affecting the health of the people that will be living here. Other noise issues. I brought up the problem of noise during construction at the last meeting. David attempted to address it in his report. I still feel that a sound fence on the west side of the property is needed to mitigate this problem, and it should be added to the conditions of the use permit and site design. Again, the effectiveness of a sound wall is only effective if it's at least 12 to 15 feet high. Air quality has not been addressed for the occupants of the apartment development. We all know there will be air pollution from vehicle exhaust along Broadway and trucks idling at the loading dock on Clay Street. Shouldn't be Shouldn't this be studied since it will affect the health of the families that will be living there? Also, the air quality during construction and its environmental impact on the adjacent properties should be studied and a more stringent written mitigation plan be made conditional upon approvals. Water and sewer capacity has been a question for every major construction project in Sonoma. There are a lot of projects being proposed in this city. What reports do we have that reassure us that we can meet these demands on our systems? We need more information so that we are not creating another situation where our city is subject to more fines. My question to my fellow commissioners is, do we need an EIR so we can feel confident we are doing our best effort to protect Sonoma and the occupants of this development? And should this project be redesigned to better mitigate the known environmental problems with this site? Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Sack.
I just wanted to start off by thanking Saha and city staff for all that they have done to put this together. I know it's been a lot of work and it's been a long time. Overall, looking at the scale and the massing of the project, I feel that it is compatible with the area. All the additional studies that you have done have confirmed that with the roof heights, the elevations, the cross sections. There has been significant changes that you've made with careful consideration to the design and the neighborhood. The entire west side of the property is not usable per conditions of approval, and that will be a buffer area for the site. And I appreciate those changes that you have made. So aesthetically, and from the massing scale, I feel that you did a really great job in the design. It doesn't cater to the automobile. It's very pedestrian friendly. From the street, from Clay Street and Broadway, you don't really see parking. It's engaging with the street and the design elements that you have implemented. I feel that the palette is a nice array of textures and colors. In terms of the environmental noise, in response to the noise exposure on the units on Broadway and Clay, if you look all along Broadway, there are homes built all along the corridor. So I'm comfortable with the mitigations proposed. I feel like it's a reoccurring condition, and there's so much you can do in that case. Let's see, traffic and transportation. A traffic study was conducted on a Friday, April 14th, and these projections incorporated 40 years ahead into the level of service, and found that the level of service will continue to stay A on Broadway and C on Clay for the left turn lane. In addition, you're adding restriping Broadway and including that left turn lane for safety issues. So I feel that that will mitigate that issue. In terms of parking, I feel that's kind of a hard one for me, but given that, it's hard to evaluate something without having something to compare it to, but given that there is another project in Sonoma, the Firehouse Apartments with less percentage of parking spaces per unit that has a history of, not having any issues, I feel that kind of gives it a good precedence. The potential conflicts of the loading dock were looked at. There was a video that was taken over a week's time, and that was reviewed. I've seen videos sent to us, and the trucks are, they are an issue, but they are parked. They're parked parked on Clay Street on the south side, and it does look as though that cars can pass them. And there's so much we can do with that. Overall, I'm in support of the project. I think it's a great design, has a good flow to it. This addresses our housing needs in Sonoma. This is, you know, an important corridor, and aesthetically, I feel that it fits.
Thank you. Commissioner McDonald.
Thank you. I want to also thank the applicant and staff for spending a great deal of time on thinking through and putting together a plan that is thoughtful, so I appreciate that. On a personal note, I grew up and lived in an affordable housing project as a child in South San Francisco, so I know how important affordable housing is for people. Me coming from a single parent household, it was very important for my family to be able to live and participate in a community and live in a comfortable space. So this project also is very important to me because I think Sonoma needs to encourage these types of developments. I also wanted to say that I also spent a great amount of time looking at the Firehouse Station project and the Valley Oaks project and the new project built in Agua Caliente. I spent 3 or sometimes 4 individual days looking at what was taking place during the day and the evening. And so I think I have a really a sense of like how these spaces operate, those that are brand new versus those that have been seasoned and been around for a while. I want to say that I'm supportive of an affordable housing project in the city. I'm supportive of this project, but I do have reservations, and I can explain those in greater detail. I think one of the most important things about a project is that you don't call it a project, you call it a home. You call it a place for community. And this is going to be an addition to our Sonoma community. And living in an affordable housing project, one of the things that always was either good or bad was the fact of whether or not a project felt like it was part of a community or whether it was an adjunct housing development for people that were low income could live in. And I think that this project has stepped up to the plate and has done a lot to make this a community and a village. But I believe that we can also improve upon this project. And so what I would like to see actually is not so much redesigning the project in terms of reducing the number of units, but I really think that the project itself reads as a project by how it relates to the buildings surrounding it. You know, we've looked at heights and elevations of buildings, comparing it to single-family homes subdivisions to hotels to mixed-use developments. But really what we should be looking at is not so much comparing it to everything around it, but looking at it as how it interrelates to the Sonoma community. The way I read the elevations of the buildings along not only Clay Street but Broadway, as it looks as one a housing development that doesn't really relate to the city itself. I see a very static design. I see a design and roof lines that look like the solar panels almost dictate the design versus how the project would feel to the person living in it. If you take a look at some of the slides that the applicant provided for the Valley Oaks project, and if you take a look at the Firehouse Station Village project, you'll see projects that are set even lower and provide a much more human scale in terms of the materials, the size and spacing of the windows, and a variation of roof lines that bring the project even closer to the street. When I am in those spaces, I feel more like a village, provides a sense of community. But when I look at the Clay Street perspective and I look at the Broadway perspective, I see a very cold, austere facade that really needs to be warmed up. This does not read Sonoma to me. And if I was a child growing up in this development, I would always feel like I was in a development that was kind of like not really a part of the community, but something that was adjunct to it. I think that the developer has done a real wonderful process in developing a very thoughtful, pedestrian-oriented site plan, but the architecture and the height and the static nature of the buildings as they read really needs to be improved. So I would really look at varying the roof elevations, staggering the roof elevations, looking at window placement a lot better to make it look more of a residential project. I really think that the barn or agricultural building concept doesn't really apply to some place where people actually want to live and feel like they're in a neighborhood. I think that we need to step back and look at what's been very successful in the city of Sonoma and why people want to live here. And it's our little neighborhoods. It's the cute buildings and bungalows. And I see that we have already built these projects in Sonoma and they're successful and they're high density. So, so I know we've already set a precedent in the valley and in the city. And so I'm not saying that this project, in terms of the density, doesn't work. I'm saying that the project, as it reads and as it feels, doesn't feel like it's part of Sonoma. So I really would almost like to see the applicant come back and have us look at a project that has more variation in terms of the overall height and also stepping back the projects and creating a project that I think might read better along the street. A good example is the elevations from building 2 and 3. If you're driving down Broadway Street, the project really reads as a very static project. It's a very one flat roof elevation that almost kind of, I don't think that we really even have an elevation of how it reads from the driveway, but if you take a look at the elevations from that, you see like one long building that I think we could really break it up that way. So, so I think that we really need to do a lot better in terms of the design itself. Now, I brought up a number of issues to staff and to the applicant with respect. Thank you. That's the elevation I'm looking at. That's a perfect example of like really, I know that the buildings are trying to retain simplicity, but I really think that this concept of the large agricultural building, the single form, really needs to really be broken up. And sometimes the Design Review Commission can do stuff, but then they sometimes are limited by what the planning department, the Planning Commission has approved. And I really would like to see a better a scale and massing that we can approve and have it move forward for more articulate review by the Design Review Commission. Okay, so getting back to my issues that I had to do, that I brought up about operations, I went through a litany of questions, and what it all comes down to is the property management company saying that they have assurances in their leases to limit the number of people in the units, quiet hours. I mean, I could go on, but you recall all the the items that I brought up. We don't really have any assurances other than the property owner, which I'm sure will be around for 50 years, but we have no guarantee or warranty that the property could be transferred, or there might be new management. So I'd like to see some way in which the operations of this village and housing project as part of the use permit can establish some sort of parameter so it runs with the land and not with the current operator of the development. So I'd like to maybe see if staff could talk to us about that if we were to condition this project to include those sort of assurances. I also brought up the idea of the loading zone across the street. Right now, it's striped or painted yellow, but there's no hours of operation. And if we were to move forward with this housing development, I would like to be able to assure that we have as much on-street parking as possible, since we are going to be impacting it and the city will be approving a project with reduced parking. So I'd like to see a way for us to be able to restrict the hours to allow for people to park in those yellow zones at night and in the morning before, so people can use that parking at night, because it's going to be really valuable to have that parking. I had mentioned other things such as traffic calming on site, and I really, if we were to move forward with this project, I'd like to have a condition added that there would be a traffic calming plan with signage, with specific details to assure staff that we would be slowing down the traffic. I think colorization of surfaces is one thing, and maybe textures, but I also think that deterrents such as speed bumps and signs are also really important. I observed at two of the housing developments that I visited on several occasions in the evening and during the day, children riding their bicycles in the parking lot, and cars driving through, and cars parking in areas where they weren't supposed to be parking, and causing visibility issues. So I really think that we need to develop a traffic calming plan for the internal circulation. The other issues that I have to do also with the maintenance of the landscaping, and again, we're suggesting a reduction in the amount of open space. And if you take a look at the site devoted to stormwater, swales, and bioretention areas, it includes a significant portion of the landscaping along the Clay Street frontage. And what I'm concerned about is this has been a program that we've been introducing into our projects for several years, but we really don't have a standard condition that requires ongoing maintenance and ways of the city enforcing it, so we don't create flooding on streets like Broadway or Clay because of lack of maintenance of these stormwater systems. Because again, the water is not going into our stormwater system, it's staying on site. And when those systems don't work, then it does create flooding on the streets because it's not hooked up to our stormwater system. So I'd like to see some condition added that allows for the city to enforce maintenance of those stormwater swales. With respect to the landscape plan itself, I think that it adds some really wonderful features. And I had mentioned the fact, however, that I believe that the children's play area, we should really consider looking at some sort of gating to keep children in. And so I'd like to have the applicant consider that. I think it's really important to provide additional safety. I don't know if you're going to allow pets and dogs on site, but that also adds assurances that people's pets and dogs don't run out onto Broadway, which is a really busy street. So I think that's really important to consider. Also, just taking a look at the landscape plan itself, most of the large trees that are being proposed for screening and for the parking lot are deciduous. They're not evergreen. So I'd like to have the applicant explore some additional tree selections and provide more variety and provide more opportunities for evergreen trees on site. So I'd like to have the applicant look at that. But on all, I really, I'm in favor of this project. I'm not opposed to the density. However, I believe that the buildings themselves really don't fit in with Sonoma. And there's some site planning issues for safety and practicality, like I had mentioned, the waste being so far away and having people to walk to it. I really think that we should take the comments of the commission and maybe relook at improving the design and some of the site planning issues, so we can really get a really good project that we can consider as an asset to the community and to everybody that lives here.
Commissioner Bohar.
Thank you. Well, I must say, I was disappointed to find out that this may or may not be of major benefit to our city in terms of alleviating our need for affordable housing for mostly working people and people of low income. It would appear to me there's clearly going to be a benefit, but it's rather uncertain now. I guess I was under the mistaken impression that we were going to have all or primarily Sonoma citizens. So that's disappointing. But I think it also gives me a feeling that given that we don't know what our benefit's going to be, it certainly should be a project that will complement our town now. It's even more important that it complement our town and our culture and history, as well as the idea of a Broadway corridor that is the entrance to our town and should suggest and enhance that trip down Broadway. And this part of town should be improved along the ideals of the general plan, even more so now. Just a comment on this loading dock business, because I think for the record, we ought to understand that better. Mr. Goodison, it's my understanding that it's a loading area on the street, that there's no loading dock, which is something different. Is that accurate?
I don't have a definition that I'm using. They call it the dock.
Okay.
I mean, that's just how it's commonly referred to. It has a very short, steep grade, and I'm going to say that whatever you want to call it, it's badly designed. But
Okay.
I don't know what definition
I don't
to
want
use.
to pontificate here, but it happens that industrial real estate is my business for 30 years, and I've been on the design team of 30 or 40 manufacturing and distribution buildings that have docks, 10, 20, 30 docks, and there's no dock there that I can see. A dock is a 110 to 130 foot span where a major over-the-road truck can back into a dock, which is 46 inches high, forklift drives in and pulls the stuff out fast, and the truck leaves. We don't have that.
They don't have that.
Right. We have a loading area. It should have had a loading dock, but I wasn't here when the lodge was approved, but what I think happened is that loading docks eat up area where you could have hotel rooms and bars and restaurants, and they figured a way to not get a loading dock because it would have had probably an in and out. Usually they have an in dock and an out dock for goods. That would have been 50 feet wide and 120 feet long, and it would have gone right into what they have as a hotel. So they kind of rode in on a big bonus there. They're using our public street for loading and interfering with traffic. It should not have happened. And it's a reminder that we should never let that happen on any new development. Particularly, the only reason why we load on the streets around the square is that that's the only thing they can do. But new development should never be allowed to have loading in the street anymore. Don't have it, or have it the responsibility of the landowner. Anyway, I want to stop with that, but I don't know how we fix that problem. I would like to very much support Commissioner Coleman's concept of a sound wall in the project as it sits. I think a sound wall is really important for the neighbors, all the way down, not just for the parking lot. I'm very much in favor of that. I'd also like to second Commissioner McDonald's observations on the two projects that Mr. Cooperman presented. Flashed a few scenes. I said, wow, that looks really interesting. It's very different than this. It's not massive, and it's interesting architecture. It looks like it has interesting mobility around, walking. I see a lot of landscaping. I see some nice porches with plenty of room on them. Now, it may be that those projects are of a different income level, and this architecture, correct me if I'm wrong, could be less expensive per square foot to put tenants in. And maybe that's important to meet the income levels that you have in this site. I don't know that. I think the projects that you showed on the additional ones, the two, that's probably more expensive to build. So that's something I can't address. But I support Commissioner McDonald's articulation much better than I could. I don't have the vocabulary to describe why those two projects were appealing, but they were very appealing. Just a quick whiff of them was very appealing. Something like that here, I'd be very attracted to. So my last comment would be my street tree idea, which I still think is a gesture towards the important policy of the general plan for the Broadway corridor. I think this area really needs to have that same feeling and theme up the street. I think those mature street trees on an even separation out in the Caltrans property, likely, that's the only place they could go and have a place to grow, mature trees. I think in any case, that's really important. That sort of solidifies the trip up Broadway. So I really would hope that we could have those street trees in place in any case, whatever reconfiguration you may be able to do with the project. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. Well, on some aspects, I'll agree and disagree with my fellow commissioners, but I think the one thing we can all agree is we want to thank the applicant, staff, and the public for their input on this project. You know, as expected, kind of big picture, obviously the more immediate neighbors are the most likely to be most sensitive about aspects of the project. And, you know, like any type of activity like this, there's a degree of give and take that's necessary. We need housing. We need housing of all kinds. And no one project, I don't think, should have to bear the burden of satisfying all the housing needs of a community. We've talked about this in other meetings. This is not the only project that we've looked at. There are several others. And so I think this satisfies a niche. It's been a long identified project as a housing opportunity site, specifically for this type of housing. And I think it's time that we get it done and built in some way. So, and I just think in this day and age, it's, as was pointed out by a few of the commenters, you know, I mean, density is the reality. I mean, if we're going to do an infill project, if we're not going to sprawl, then we have only really the option of increasing the density of housing. And that is the character of Sonoma as much as the barracks and an adobe and a bungalow and anything else is, because they all represented the predominant housing form and the socioeconomic climate and what was available at the time that they were built. And our community is not a static element. It is a growing, living, vibrant thing. And so here we are in 2017, and we need to continue and grow and be vibrant. We won't be that if we just simply repeat the forms of the past. So we need to think differently and be doing something differently. So I think that this project addresses that. You know, I was kind of roughly going to go through the different areas that were in the environmental review, but I won't. I think many of them have been covered already, but so I'm going to skim through here quickly. I think, you know, aesthetically, I guess, you know, it's the old beauty's in the eye of the beholder. I think less is more, and I see that in these simple forms and the reference to the agrarian aspects and the agrarian history of the project. So in that way, I think it pays homage to the community, and I think to try and do something different there is unnecessary. I think part of looking at those simple forms in the elevations and things we're seeing now, it's without the landscape, it's without people, it's without that activation that a little bit of time will bring on something. So I'm completely fine with the way they are, and I appreciate the fact that the community building brings a little bit more of a modern element to it, and, you know, references a different point in time. And I think the privacy issues have been well addressed with the plantings and the fact that it really isn't going to be yards that are on the western border. I mean, we're talking about adding 20-some trees. By my count, there were about 7 pretty mature trees already in the backyards of residents along Bragg Street. And while there was great concern about privacy and issues, as best I could count, there were about 19 north and south facing windows on the second floors of those buildings that were, I think they look like they have a minimum setback of maybe 5 feet, so they're about 10 feet apart. Certainly having a row of trees and buildings situated 15 to 20 feet away is actually creating more privacy than those residents already have from one another. So I don't think this project should be faulted in any way for that. And additionally, I think having that vegetation there, the idea of a sound barrier other than what would be normal and customary in this community, I think is an undue burden to put on this project, and I think one that would basically be putting a cold shoulder to the idea of a community or neighborhood. And it doesn't matter if this project's being built or whatever's going to be built, there's going to be 12 to 18 months of construction noise. That's the reality. And we've never asked any other project here in town to construct a 12 to 15 foot high masonry wall to mitigate construction noise, because I think in the long run, you don't want something like that around anyway, so you would just have to tear it down afterwards, and that would be a tremendous waste for a minor inconvenience. Air quality, a lot of people concerned about that. I mean, you're on Broadway. You know, we unfortunately don't have a metric other than the ones that we have for the Bay Area. Air quality, yes, I'm sure there is particulate matter from diesels and other things in that vicinity, but we don't have a way, at least now, to accurately measure that. And again, you can't burden this project with all the traffic that's on Broadway. So I don't think that's an issue. I don't really think this project is responsible for litigating the faults that might have occurred when the lodge was approved and that loading dock was put in. You know, the reality is, I think as someone commented earlier, that someone's just going to be happy to live here because they're going to have a home. And some people say, well, I might be looking at a loading dock and I have to keep my windows closed a little, you know. on Broadway, you know, I mean, it's noise. So sometimes you close the windows, sometimes you don't. You don't have to do it 7 by 24, 365, but you might when it's appropriate. I think, you know, the rudimentary things, biological resources, cultural resources, those have all been addressed, and it seems like no one's majorly concerned about that. You know, just back on the whole, does this fit with the general plan and the land use? I think it does. I think the setbacks exceptions that are being asked for are relatively minor. I know I've disagreed with Mr. Bohar on this before on another project, but I think it's really important to push things to the street. I mean, if you look at the historic development patterns, most older homes used to sit, and most buildings used to sit much closer to the street than we customarily build them today, because I think that's part of what engages people who have a front porch with the people passing by in the communities on their bikes and walking and so forth. I think those are all my comments. I would be ready to move forward with approval. I sense there are at least 2 nay votes as the project stands, and there's probably some issues to be addressed, but having we all spoke now, if any other commissioners would like to make any additional points at this point, or if someone wants to try and make a motion, I'm open to that.
If I may, I'd like to just address some of the conditions, questions that were raised. In terms of maintaining the stormwater BMPs, condition 2C addresses that. Provides for inspections and maintenance requirements. On the lease terms, the kind of the operational things that Commissioner McDonald raised, that is typically addressed in the affordable housing agreement, and we can add reference to that.
Could I just do the chair?
That's condition number 24.
Okay.
Sorry.
So would the items that I brought up with in terms of the number of people per unit, keeping porches and balconies clear, those sorts of things that the developer wants to do, like security, monitoring, those sorts of things, if they have some sort of language in a lease, something that we can add to this, so it transfers with the land and not with the
Well, there's going to be different ways to address that. Let me ask our city attorney to weigh in.
So one of the things that we typically do with regard to affordable housing projects is, as part of the affordable housing agreement for the rental project, require the operator of the affordable housing project to submit a management plan. That management plan is subject to the review and approval of the city, and the management plan itself is what contains the operational requirements, tenanting issues. It's pretty standard for every affordable housing project to have an overall management plan. In reviewing that management plan, we get into those types of things that you discussed about maintenance and, you know, how do they respond to tenant requests? What's their process for tenant complaints, issues among tenants? What is their tenanting process? What is their eviction process? All of that is usually contained within the management plan itself.
So,
And I'm sorry, and one other thing, the affordable housing agreement is recorded against the property and runs with the land, referencing that plan. Now, a new operator may come in and have a different management plan that they would propose, but again, that would come back to the city for review at that time.
perfect. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And I think that the kind of design types of traffic calming measures that you mentioned could be addressed in a design review condition potentially.
Okay.
The trickier question is that of just the overall architectural approach that's been taken with the project.
Yes. and-
So, you know, there are basically two different ways to address that. One is to say to the Design Review Commission, if there's a majority consensus on the Planning Commission to do so, that the Design Review Commission needs to kind of take that up and address it as part of its review of the project. The other option that you have would be to continue the project in order to allow the applicants to provide you with a different concept to review.
Okay.
Through the chair.
Certainly.
Again, I just want to go on the record to make it very clear to the audience, people watching TV, to the council, that I'm not saying that I'm not supportive of the density or the site plan. My concern and reservation has to do with the overall bulk and height of the buildings, and that I believe that we could do a lot better in terms of staggering the roofs, providing some additional articulation. And I know that as when I served on the Design Review Commission, a lot of times we felt that we were restricted in terms of the overall height and not allowing changes to the bulk and density of the buildings and reducing those, and that we felt that we had real limitations to just talking about architecture and fenestration. And what I'm talking about is really taking a serious look at breaking these buildings up even more. And I think that that thoughtful process should be looked at also by the Planning Commission, because again, what we're doing is we're looking at a use permit, and we're looking at not so much a site plan and architectural review, but we're looking at its consistency with the general plan, with the historic overlay design guidelines, with infill housing guidelines. There's a whole series of things that suggest that to create buildings that are compatible, not only with the immediate areas, but also with the concept of livable infill housing. And so I'm not suggesting that this isn't livable. What I'm suggesting is that we could do a lot more to make it compatible and with Sonoma. And so anyway, I don't know how my other commissioners feel about that. That are generally receptive to the site plan and the overall project, but anyway, that's how I feel.
Commissioner Sack, yeah.
I would be willing to refer that to the Design Review Committee if that was something you're up to.
I think that, just weighing here, that would be my preference as well. I mean, because you know, again, there's alternative ways to sort of, you know, sort of stack the boxes, if you will, and decorate them in the simplest forms. I mean, I hear you saying you're in general agreement with the density, and the mass and scale in theory. I mean, is it really just the roof height or the ridge line? I'm not sure. That's why, because I don't know how else you vary that other than just with, if you're talking about roof forms, because otherwise you're not going to be able to fit the same number
I'm
of.
talking about reducing the height of the buildings, and what I'm suggesting is that we need to look at a design that looks at lowering the heights of the buildings. We have examples in our community right now that clearly can be, that that are 2 to 3 feet lower in height than what's being proposed along Broadway. And building, God, my eyes are so bad, building 8 is 30 feet tall at its peak, and I really think that we should be looking at reducing the height of that building. That seems to be a big source of contention with a lot of the neighbors, feeling that we could do more to lower the height of that building and reduce its bulk. And I think it's our responsibility as a commission to consider those neighbors' requests. I'm not suggesting lowering the density or changing the number of units, but simply looking at reducing the scale and bulk of the buildings. And I think that we, as a commission, to make the findings that is consistent with the general plan, to make the findings that is generally compatible with the requirements of our infill housing ordinance, and also the historic overlay that we deserve to be able to look at a revised elevations and reduced heights of the buildings.
Through the chair.
May I add
Certainly.
something here?
Yeah, well, I'll do Mr. Coleman first, and then, yeah.
I looked at that as well, and I was trying to figure out how we could resolve some of the height issues. And looking at the plan, it looked as if the room ceilings were, for instance, on building 8, which is 30 feet, they were 10 feet. So maybe there's a way to modify that to 9 feet or 8 feet. If you do it twice per story, then that's 2 feet if you reduce a foot each ceiling. If in fact they're 10 feet ceilings. So maybe there's a way to reduce maybe that's one avenue.
Oh, may I just, I really apologize for interrupting, but I'm informed that Building 8 can be designed in the same manner as 6 and 7 with a 26-foot height.
Okay.
And would that be reducing the actual ceiling then?
Well, however buildings 6 and 7 are done, that's how they would do it.
Okay, Commissioner Bohar, you had a comment you wanted to?
I am emphatically enthusiastic about the last 2 sets of comments that Commissioner McDonald has made. He was articulate. He had the regulations and general plan in mind. I would support that very enthusiastically. I think to refer this to the Design Review Commission would be to kick the can down the road and abdicate our responsibility here. I feel strongly about that.
Can I make a recommendation for a motion?
Sure, certainly.
It might not be popular, but I make a recommendation that we continue this item to our, maybe not necessarily a date certain.
If I may interrupt, I would recommend that if you make a motion, you continue it to a date certain, and that date be October 12th.
Okay, October 12th. It is. Make a recommendation that we continue it to the October 12th hearing. A lot of comments have been submitted to you from our commission, and hopefully some of these items can maybe even be addressed on the site plan and also architecturally and in terms of the scale and bulk and height.
I have one more through the chair.
Certainly.
I have a request for David. Given that I have a passion for the residents on Clay Street that are going to have to deal with the noise and particulate matter and everything else involved with the loading dock, I mentioned in my closing comments about a higher source. So could we have a condition that at least the mayor of our city or somebody with some authority, it seems unusual, but could somebody actually address, contact the lodge, corporate management, whatever, to make a formal request so that they actually have to maybe, they have to answer it. They have to actually give a legitimate reason why they can or can't accommodate the wishes of the commission, or myself, or maybe the commission if we have to make a vote up and down. I'm not sure if we have to make a vote. But I would like to, at least on my part, try to help these residents so in the future they don't have to breathe or deal with noise that the neighbors have already been dealing with for 18, 20 years. Because they're going to be directly across from it. People that have been dealing with it are diagonal to it, but it's still an issue enough for them to have raised the alarm bells. The big elephant in the room is the loading dock for me. And so I would wish we could have a condition that the mayor, the whole council, whatever it takes, address something to the lodge, the management or the corporate, to address their inadequate loading dock. Because I couldn't even call it a dock. It's just an offloading zone, if that's possible.
We're happy to look at that issue.
Okay, so back to,
Okay.
you would
So-
like to make a
Okay,
motion?
so,
Yes.
so the motion would be to continue it to the October 16th, 12th meeting, taking into consideration the comments made by the commission with respect to improving the site planning, extending and expanding the landscaping along Broadway, and also looking at reducing the heights of the buildings, reducing their bulk, and improving their appearance by creating more articulation along the street elevations and also elevations facing Broadway, such as we discussed, I guess.
Well, just to, if I may, just make sure that I understand the nature and intent of the motion. I mean, just as an individual commissioner, I took your comments to be pretty specific that you are not looking for fundamental changes in the site plan, but rather for changes in the architectural concepts. Is that correct?
Exactly. And I think commissioners also talked about additional landscaping along Broadway, which is something, is a site planning and landscaping issue.
Okay, so that was a motion?
That's my motion.
All right, all right, I just wanted to make sure that that was the motion. Do I hear a second?
Second.
All right, any discussion? All right, we'll have a roll call vote.
Commissioner Bohar.
Aye.
Commissioner McDonald.
Aye.
Commissioner Sack.
No.
Commissioner Coleman.
No.
Chair Cribb.
Aye.
The motion passes 3-2.
Great.
Very well.
Thank you very much. All right, we will see the applicant back here at our October 12th meeting, and I'm sure many of you in the public. All right. Okay, well, the meeting has not been adjourned.
No, we're not.
Who's anxious to get out of here?
Yeah.
I'm anxious.
Sorry.
All right. Very quickly, Commissioner Coleman. Commissioner Coleman, could I ask you to return to the dais? The meeting's not adjourned. We're
Special meeting, you do special things.
okay. Any comments from my fellow commissioners?
I have one comment. The agenda.
Microphone.
The agenda indicates this is a regular meeting. It should be a special meeting of September, or words to that effect.
We did post a corrected agenda. Thank you.
Okay.
I got that. Okay, I have, anybody else? I have just one comment, only because the clock is ticking for many of us. We got the notice that if we intend to be on the commission, we wish to reapply. My question is, and I guess this is really of legal staff, because I read that there were going to be no interviews. So my question is, we're still acting commissioners. If we are contacted by someone on council, if more than one person contacts us to ask us about something, is that a Brown Act violation?
It is not, provided that you do not share with the more than one council member the conversation you had with the other. So as a for instance, 3 council members could contact 1 or more commissioners to have a conversation with you.
Right.
When the second and third one, under my scenario, were to contact you, you don't share information that you've been contacted by 2 others.
So as long as they.
One-way
you would
conversation
still
is
be
fine.
free to talk about anything?
You would
or-
still be free to talk about with that council member about your feelings, but you wouldn't be sharing with them the conversation that you had with the others.
With the others.
Correct.
Okay, so we would be, I was just concerned about that. Yeah.
Right, and it is true relative to their not doing a formal interview process, as you had pointed out, but individual council members, based on their individual appointments, will likely be reaching out.
And that was
to-
my
of
concern. I
course.
thought,
Right.
yeah, and I just wanted to make sure that, if 2 people called me, would it be just like, well, I'm sorry.
I can't talk to you, I already talked to so-and-so. No,
Yeah,
I mean,
okay.
no,
All right,
that's fine.
great.
Thank you.
All right. Anyone else? Do I hear a motion to adjourn?
I make a motion to adjourn.
All right, a second?
I'll second that.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, great. Thank you.
Technically, October could be our last.